Okay, so hypothetically we should be live. Let's see.
Oh, 1 second. I'll just
Let's see if
Ooh.
that's true.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Japan/Korea/wherever you are in the world. I'm here with my good friend Philip from Irish Medieval History, and today we are going to be talking about a stupidly controversial topic: Africans in medieval Europe, and did medieval Africa even exist? It's a question that no one should ever have to answer, but that's the world in which we find
What?
ourselves. How are you doing this morning, Philip?
What am I doing this morning? I
No,
don't know. I
how?
just got a.
How? Not what.
Well, my doing this morning. Well, I kind of just kind of got out of bed. Went for a little bit of a walk while everyone else is making their way home, and now kind of just in front of the laptop, just kind of taking in reality while my brain slowly but surely wakes up to this exciting reality that we have to answer this brilliant question that is, did Africa exist in the medieval period? And clearly, it didn't exist, did it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty certain that Africans are convinced that it existed, and I'm also convinced that they knew about and interacted with Europe. So we're going to get into some pretty interesting information. Philip's going to be sharing the connections between Ireland and Africa, and I'm very excited about that because I have to say that's a blank spot on my canvas. And I'm going to be
Aye.
sharing a bit more of a broader view. We've broken it down by geography, basically. So we're going to be looking at Ireland and Spain and Italy and England. Little look into France, Constantinople, which, yes, that was part of Europe, everyone. And of
Hmm.
course, finally, we're going to end with what we know about the Kingdom of Bohemia in this area, because of course this all started with with you know Kingdom Come Deliverance originally, and now it's come up again in Kingdom Come Deliverance too. So let's just go
Aye.
ahead and start this rocket, as they say. I'm going to go ahead and share the thing. Now the format is, everyone, we have an eye on the chat, and if you have any comments or questions, please do let us know.
Thanks, we have to turn on my chats there. Boo, boo, boo. Off the sound anyway, at least.
Yeah, for some reason,
Uh,
Discord is refusing to actually open the share
oh, she's
screen.
being cranky this morning, is she?
Yeah,
This
why should technology work with us when it can work against us?
Oh, it's the never-ending problem with us.
Trying to.
Everyone's just saying the old good morning this morning. Hello, good morning, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. How are you all keeping this morning?
What is everyone drinking in their respective time zones? I've got a nice young Kyosen green tea to sort of start the day.
Uh, can everybody hear us completely fine?
Oh, to
No one
hell
can
with
hear
it.
us. No, I'm joking.
Okay, well, they won't be able to see us, but at least they can see the presentation. Okay.
That's the main thing.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so we're here, everyone. There are two disembodied voices, but I swear we're here. Discord just decided it didn't want to play ball on sharing all the screens this morning. So, yeah. Why are we doing this, right? Why now? Well, the main thing is that it's, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 features this, I believe, Philip, could you tell us about this gentleman?
Isn't that what's his name? The Great. Now you've tripped me off guard straight away.
I mean, the name
um,
isn't so important, but who is he? What is he doing in the game?
well, in the game itself, you're dealing with a very educated man that has travelled from Mali. Ah, that's why it slightly slipped me up a wee bit. I've got a delay on my side. That's why it slightly caught me
Oh,
up.
that's
Right.
fun.
Uh, yeah, yeah. No, now I can see what you're talking about. So this particular character is a African character from Mali at the time, the Kingdom of Mali, and he is a part of the Islamic connection, which don't get me wrong, many people, especially around Ireland and Britain, wouldn't be so educated as we are with the medieval history of Ireland and Britain. So it's forgivable that we're quite not as educated or aware of how huge the Islamic connection is in the medieval period at the time. And this particular character is from Africa, and at the time, the Caliphate, the whole Islamic connection, the trade routes, what was going on in the Muslim world, is not just connected with the likes of West Africa, South Sahara Africa, but it also goes as far as the Middle East. And so people from Mali were able to travel all the way over to Mecca, which is deep in the Muslim world between Africa and the Middle East. And from there, he's able to travel into the Ottoman Empire, into the Mediterranean, make his way over to the likes of Venice, then over to eventually Constantinople, because that's all in the Mediterranean world that he's able to connect to from the Muslim world. So from the Muslim world, from Mali, he's able to get into the Mediterranean world, as seen in the presentation here. And then from the Mediterranean world, he makes his way into Venice, into Europe. And from Europe, he's able to go back into, obviously, the Mediterranean connection again, into Constantinople. And from there, within the Ottoman Empire, he's able to go over between the fighting happening between the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire. However, it's understandable that a lot of people are unaware of the Muslim connection, the Islamic connection of sub-Saharan Africa,
Right.
going into Mecca, and then from Mecca into the greater trading connections that are happening in the
Yeah.
wider world.
I mean,
And that seems.
I think it's definitely a general problem with a lot of history taught throughout the West, Europe and
Mm,
America, that it seems to be very locally focused. So I think a lot of,
yeah.
most people don't realize how interconnected the medieval world was. They imagine that everyone was born and died in the same village, that they never set foot beyond it, and they had no concept of anything beyond, 5 miles around their person, which is it's just not
Mm.
true.
Yeah, that's very, very true.
um,
We do have various travelers traveling within the medieval world for various reasons, from bards to people seeking greater, wider education, like our gentleman here,
right.
um, to all sorts of reasons why people one day within their small little village settlement would need to go out and travel. This period in particular, we see people stuck in the Balkans in particular, and they're sandwiched between the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And our gentleman here has kind of gotten caught up between, although he's traveling between the Mediterranean world and the Muslim world. The reason why he gets stuck in Bohemia is because he's literally sandwiched between the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire, and they're fighting in the Balkans. And you would have probably seen very much a mixing of different various cultures and everything going through the Balkans in this period. Another problem that I've come across is people comparing, when I've been talking to various people because of this video game, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, is they do a lot of comparisons with England to Western Europe. And there's a assumption that it's the same kind of movement of culture going on, when, as I pointed out clearly there, because the Ottoman Empire and its eastern side of its empire is caught up with the fighting with the Ottoman Empire, we see a lot of influences coming with the Ottoman Empire and the movement of people within their empire. And that's how you get this gentleman into the Holy Roman Empire. It's something that, granted, we do have a different form of a trade link between the Mediterranean and England, but I think some people need to remember that not all of Western Europe is like England in the medieval period. And I think that's where some people get tripped up, is that their minds think of, when they think of the medieval world, they think of England and the various cultures that are in England at the time, and they forget that we're dealing with the Holy Roman Empire, we're dealing with the Czech Republic, we're dealing with Bohemia, and where Bohemia is located on the map is different to where England is located on the map, and the movement of cultures and people, you know?
Well, but even then, when I go to talk about England, I'm convinced we're going to get some very angry English people commenting. But the reality is that England was more colorful than they want to admit.
Mm,
even
mm,
even
mm.
in the medieval period, and that's primarily because of the Crusades, honestly.
Yeah, I
So
was about
so
to
you know,
say that.
people forget just how international a movement the Crusades were. It was this mass migration basically of Western
Mm.
Europeans to the Middle East, to the Holy Land. And when they went home, they didn't only take goods with them, they took people with them. And then of
I
course
was
they
literally,
forget,
yeah.
they forget about the Spain is always forgotten. It's funny because on this
Mm,
map there's this green line. This map that's on the thing. There's this green line cutting across the top of the Iberian Peninsula,
mm,
and I find that really
yeah.
apt because that's kind of what most people who study French history, or people in school history, not like actual scholars,
Mm,
but for the English school system, for the French school system, it's almost like Spain just doesn't exist until the 16th century.
yeah.
So,
Um,
yeah.
just a few people pointing out that they can't hear me. Can you guys hear me now, or am I still
Oh no,
off?
he said there's a bit of reverberation, which I turned my volume down. So, oh wait, or is there something else? Has something
No, I
already
think that
been?
might be it. If you guys can hear me, can you just comment below there so we can make those
Yeah. Is
alterations and
is
changes?
is
Well,
is our is our
anyway.
sound still good? Because technology hates us. We're medievalists.
Yes, people forget that a lot. I had actually had that yesterday, where people were looking for me to fix a whole load of problems to do with their site and their connections and stuff, and they were like, "Oh, but you're a young person, you can fix all these problems," and I'm like, "No,
I mean,
I
I
don't have a
can.
clue what I'm doing."
I'm a great troubleshooter, but the reality is I don't want. That's not where I want my creative energies to go.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Oh,
um,
stop.
so I'd like to some of the problems I think a lot of people are having actually come back to language, um,
Mm,
because you know um, words, the documentary evidence we have can be either misinterpreted, overinterpreted, underinterpreted, or missed entirely because of the challenges of medieval language versus modern language to describe people of color, different ethnicities, different races. And that's true in English, that's true in French and Spanish and all the European languages. They
mm,
all had different terms than we have now to talk about,
yeah,
people, and it's not consistent either. Now we all kind of
yeah.
have agreed on this almost consistent vocabulary in English and a consistent vocabulary in German to talk about black people, Asians, Latinos,
Mm,
etc. But there wasn't that kind of standardization in medieval language, and so there also wasn't necessarily a consistent use. So one of the
mm,
terms that crops up a lot to talk about, just people who are Moorish, who are
mm.
Muslim, is the word Saracen.
Okay.
And the term Saracen, and I don't know if this is true in medieval Irish, and I wish I'd thought to look it up, how what the situation was in Ireland. But the term Saracen in English and the various cognate equivalents throughout Western Europe can mean anyone who's kind of caramel colored and Muslim to very, very dark and Muslim. The
Mm,
primary purpose of the word Saracen, though, is that they're Muslim, and so we have here a 15th century, probably not entirely accurate depiction of so-called Saracens,
mm.
especially when it comes to the women folk. Possibly some accuracies, but I wouldn't rely on this German woodcut to make an authentic, quote unquote, Saracen ensemble, shall we say? But
Okay.
the point is that if you see the word Saracen in a medieval source, you can't automatically assume that they're sort of the more light-skinned, Saracens from, say, Lebanon. You can't assume that they might be a Saracen from Mali, because there were many, many Muslims in Timbuktu. You just
Mm,
All you know from that is that they were not Christian, they were Muslim, and that they were darker skinned. And that I
yeah.
you know so is there an equivalent term in medieval Irish? Did you encounter that in your explorations?
Saracen, it does appear in the Anglo-Irish wording. They do use the word Saracen a good few times, which to me isn't surprising because you're dealing with the language of the Knights Templars and the Knights Hospitallers and stuff inside of Ireland. And the movement, when we go into the period of the usage of the word Saracen and stuff, you're talking about the arrival of the Normans onto the island of Ireland, and they take over the connection between Ireland into Africa and the Middle East. And you would have had what was it called? Knights Templars, Knights Hospitallers, and stuff, moving from Ireland over to the Middle East and stuff. Even with the First Crusade, most of the movement is done from the Ustamen, the Irish Vikings, who become Crusaders. Like they're pretty much hinted from the likes of Murtig Ibrian and Turlough Ibrian. Look, you're not your family, your dynasty, because they're pretty much a part of the slave trade, which is no longer acceptable in Ireland around 1103. You're pretty much not wanted onto the island. And so, at least from 1080 onwards, they would have joined both the First Crusade and the Norwegian Crusade that follows after that one. So even straight away, it's the interpretation of the Crusaders and the First Crusade, and then later on, with the arrival of the Normans onto the island, you have the interpretation and the viewpoint of the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitallers. So yeah, you would have had that view from the Anglo-Irish interpretation, coming in from the Mediterranean over to what was it, Ireland.
Right.
But Rachel, it's very interesting that you brought that up about the bringing of people, because my dad actually recently had his DNA test done, and the weirdest thing actually happened where he actually found, I think it was 9% Middle Eastern DNA from around the Jerusalem area, which is so, like, don't get me wrong, my when he had his DNA test done, he was literally a mixture of everything that would have appeared in Limerick, which would have been, because Limerick is a trading port in Ireland, and it was a mixture of Scandinavian, English,
Right.
Gaelic. He was proper mix of what you expect to see in Limerick City. But then he had that little bit of Jerusalem, Middle Eastern, most likely from the period of the Crusades and stuff. And it's like, whoa, how did this DNA end up there? And it's not like it's a recent DNA in there. It's, slightly pushed back a wee bit.
Right.
So it's like, okay, so how did this DNA get into my dad's DNA, whose family, most of his family is around the Limerick area.
Right.
So it's very, very interesting, and it does beg the question. Okay, so how did most likely, I could imagine a crusader coming from the Limerick area, joining the wider crusade,
Right.
making his way to Jerusalem, perhaps finding a wife or even having a bastard child, perhaps, no offense to anyone here, and then going back into Limerick with his offspring, his child, when the Crusades collapsed and failed, perhaps. I don't know, but it's exciting to think about that when you've got that little hint of DNA. Now, at the same time, hard evidence after that.
No, it is funny how, with the kind of discoveries people are making once they actually have their DNA tested. Because of my family, my grandfather was 100% Italian from southern Italy, which means he was 100% Mediterranean mutt. So
Yeah.
I'm pretty certain that if I have my DNA tested, there will probably actually be some African, decidedly African DNA
Oh
in
yeah.
there, because that's, when we'll
Yeah.
get to that, that was Sicily. That was
Yeah, I was
Sicily.
just about to go wild with that one.
Yeah, no, we've got a whole section on Sicily. So
Mm,
I just want to, back to the topic. So why we're talking about Saracen, um, other terms that can be problematic in the various languages of Europe that can also have multiple, shall we say, color gradations, multiple
mm,
ethnicities kind of lumped under them. The term Moor, or Blackamoor, or Blackmoor, or Mar, in English it's got, like, of course, 7 different spellings, because no one, spelling was a creative art in the medieval period. And this term can mean, in all of the various languages, can also mean, like Saracen, it means someone who was from Northern Africa or the Middle East, or Africa, actually, because they
mm,
didn't necessarily understand the difference between Northern Africa and the rest of Africa. And again,
mm.
it seems to apply to people who could be anything from nicely tanned all the way through to, inky black. So,
Yeah.
when you see these terms Saracen and Moor, you can't make any assumptions about the person's point of origin. All you know for certain, and not even for certain, because then in the 15th century, the Italians start using the word il Moro to apply to an Italian who is just kind of dark, who has a darker complexion. he's not black, he's not African, but he has a darker complexion than the because he's in northern Italy. So for the northern Italians,
Mm-hmm.
this gentleman having this darker complexion didn't mean he was Muslim, because he wasn't. He was absolutely Christian. Um, Ludovico El Moro is who I'm speaking of. So this brings us, this really underscores the challenges of language in interpreting documentary evidence. So we that's why I want to be careful today that we don't overinterpret the history, the sources, but we also don't underinterpret it. I don't want to whitewash anything when I don't think that's appropriate either. So I'm just putting that out there for everyone.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know if the term Moor or Moorish or Blackmoor also appears in some kind of Irish cognate or equivalent. Um,
Yeah, because I know we have Shakespeare and his terminology and language usage, which then is brought into the Anglo-Irish sphere of the 15th century. And then on the Gaelic side, because you have all those Gaelic clans, like the likes of Grace O'Malley and stuff, dealing with the Barber pirates and stuff, you see the reusage of the words like Moorish, Moorish pirate, Barber pirate, Saracen.
Barbary pirates,
Um,
right? Yeah,
yeah, yeah, so you do see that language, not just the old Crusader language, popping up in the 16th century, from my interpretation, but you also see the likes of, as you pointed out there, that kind of Ottoman usage of words,
right,
which is very similar to what you're seeing in Shakespeare's work. Remembering that Shakespeare's work was flying into Ireland at the time of the late 16th century, because of Shakespeare being right next door. And you would have, most likely, you would have had, especially the likes of the butlers and stuff, who gone on very well with Elizabeth, going into plays in London and stuff as part of the culture at the time, and then bringing this usage of language back into Ireland and stuff, especially. Who was it? Especially the butlers. I'm trying to remember the Pacific Earl at the time. Um, but you know what I'm trying to say anyway, is that
yeah,
you
I
do
do.
have movement of people, especially around Kilkenny, going into London and stuff, and then coming back in with their old fancy English and stuff, and the certain Pacific words they're using, especially since they're dealing with the pirates moving in from the Mediterranean into Ireland and stuff, and fighting with the Gaelic pirates and clans and stuff.
Right.
Best example of all being Grace O'Malley, like, and you can see when you're studying Grace O'Malley, they do talk about her encountering and fighting with the Barber pirates, and it become a tick for tat, because the Barber pirates are going in to kidnap people and take slaves back to the Mediterranean.
Right.
So there is skirmish and fighting happening there, with Grace O'Malley being the best example over and over again, like.
Yeah, so it's that really it's good to know that there's similar issues, because Barbary pirates, that's also not a race. that's
Oh, is it
that's
not?
that's a denomination of origin, shall we say?
Mm,
And again, this underscores the fact that medieval Europeans did not have the same sort of concrete grasp of geography that some modern people do, because I say that, and as I think about my average fellow countrymen, their knowledge, the modern knowledge of geography, isn't necessarily so great either, and it was not better in the Middle Ages, when maps were, it's this map that we have here is late 15th, early 16th century, or no, this one is
mm,
14th century. Actually, this is a Catalan map, so it's actually, I'm pretty impressed with this map. It's one of the earliest maps like this to be commissioned. And the
mm.
reason I really love this map is because it shows, even though what looks to us, the bottom half looks like that's northern Africa, that's not northern Africa. That king in the bottom, second leaf from the left with the crown,
Okay.
that is
Mm.
that is that is the king of Mali. So that is sub-Saharan Africa, not Saharan Africa. So
Mm,
that underscores the idea that medieval people didn't necessarily understand just how far Africa went, and so for them, being from Africa is not is was kind of a general situation, but it encompassed every kind of person who lived in Africa. So
mm,
yeah.
mm.
Um, one last thing I found that I just want to kind of generally apply, and I wonder if this crops up in Ireland as well. So in medieval uh, this is Asia actually from that map. This map was massive. This map is crazy. Um, in the general medieval view of color, it's not necessarily, especially in the earlier periods of the Middle Ages, I'm thinking 11th, 12th century, color doesn't necessarily denote race as we understand it. Race
Mm,
is really kind of this, as we understand it, is an 18th century German invention. Um,
mm,
but it was connote it could actually be used to connote goodness or badness, so morality or immorality, having nothing to do
mm,
with whether someone is European, Christian, Muslim, African, Asian. None. It just there's a there's a scene in the Song of Roland where the Saracen Abisma goes from being black to white when he gets baptized. So
mm.
it it's a question of him going from being a sinful heathen to a good Christian. So you can't
Yeah.
it's so sometimes in certain medieval stories, if a character is described as being black, they don't necessarily mean, oh, he's African or he's Arabic or
Mm,
any of that. They just mean, well, he's a bad person. And there are actually depictions of demons in
uh,
a lot of 15th century illuminations, and I meant to include one. Um, I don't think I did. There are pictures of demons in 15th century illuminations. They are all
uh,
black, but they're not black. They're not Africans. That's just to the viewer to signify this is a demon, not a good person.
yeah. That's so interesting because I see the same thing again. Now, I'll just elaborate here and then I'll jump over to Susan's question. But it's so interesting that there is a difference. I'm trying to highlight the difference between the color black and people from Africa because we see the same thing in Ireland, which causes a lot of debate as well when it comes down to umbrellaing everybody in Africa. Is because, and the Irish sources do highlight this, is that there's a massive difference between the word dove, which is black, and dove is a very negative context. Black, that's bad. So when they say the black man, they're talking about the bad man. And if you're talking about somebody from even from West Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, when they move up into the trade links, into Viking Dublin and stuff, they're referred to as Far Gorum, which is weird because Far
Wow.
Gorum is blue man. Um, and the reason, and but
Ha!
it also comes in
Whoa, is
as
it really Blue Man? That's crazy
yeah,
because in a lot of earlier illuminations, black people and I mean actual like Africans that we know were supposed to be black people and Arabs are depicted as blue. Saladin is depicted often as being blue.
it's wild. Because for ages, people used to get really aggressive around that and stuff. So it's funny to actually come across that source. I haven't actually come across another medievalist that has noticed that. And I've talked to academics about this and stuff, with all their own interpretation and stuff. So it's actually brilliant that you brought that up. Never thought of that one before. Um, God, that cut me off guard.
Oh,
But
sorry.
anyway,
You're talking about blue as being the color that was actually used for people instead of black.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's wild. But Fargorum also means African person, so it's kind of African person, but also blue person at the same time, which causes a lot of debate. And you'll probably I don't know which way you'll feel about this one because I get different reactions off people. But I'm not saying names here, but I came across one academic who turned around and said, "Oh, it's because they get very cold when they come into Ireland that their skin goes blue."
what?
Yeah, 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 yeah. And I get that. I always get that. I always bring that up
Oh my
as a
god.
good conversation starter because you always get so many different reactions from people getting really worked up and angry to actually that kind of makes sense, you know.
Oh my
So
god.
I always treat them bringing that one up.
I'm gonna cry. It's because they get cold.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I actually had a
Oh,
contempt because they're coming
whoo,
in
how to tell
during
people
a
you've never seen a real
Viking
black
age.
person without saying it full out.
Yeah, 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 yeah. But yeah, we'll just take a pure innocence.
Oh my god. Okay, so Susan, I see your question. I'm going to be talking about Frederick II when we get to Sicily, so I'd like to save that question for then if you don't mind.
Mm,
Um, okay, so with all of those caveats in play, let's launch in. So, Philip, I thought we would actually lead with Ireland. I don't know why, it seemed like a good
nice.
idea. So, what can you tell us about the interactions between various parts of Africa and Ireland, Africans in Ireland, etc.?
I'm assuming, because this has a slight delay in it, but
Oh,
I'm
right. It's the
assuming you
first
put
page
the
with the monk writing, and the page with the illumination with Mary and baby
oh,
Jesus, and yeah.
that is the, I'm sure that is the going into the golden age of Ireland when you had monks writing about Egypt at the time. I do
Ah,
have one image, it'll pop up eventually, and it'll be a very good example of the invasions of Ireland as well, which
hold
is
on.
written
Okay,
around
got
the
it.
golden age of Ireland.
Got the
Oh, there we
maps.
go. So between 550 and 793, when we're in the golden age of Ireland, that's a very good example of the connection between Ireland and Africa. Because although it's very difficult to have actual solid archaeological finds at the time, except for, of course, the Book of Kells and the ink illuminate, the the various Rachel now is going to save me. I hope she does anyway. But the what they're using to go into the Book of Kells. The various inks and stuff. Not ink itself, but the different usage,
The pigments,
the
you mean?
different dyes and that. Pigments.
Pigments.
That's the
Yeah, got
word.
it.
Some of the pigments for the Book of Kells actually goes as far as Afghanistan. So in the Golden Age of Ireland, the only real proof archaeological is those little bits of finds that we have that go all the way to Afghanistan, which shows that Ireland does have that massive trade link. The majority of information during the Golden Age of Ireland comes is actually in its literature find. For example, Coptic literature, in particular, the vision literature that we see specifically in Egypt at the time, which is basically if you're a sinful person and one day you suddenly have a vision from hell. And then basically it's someone brings you into hell. One of the best examples, obviously, is Dante's Inferno, where a person goes off into hell, and from there he has the vision from God. Sorry, somebody brings him down and explains to him, look, if you don't change your ways, you're going to go to hell, you're going to burn, you're going to suffer. And then the two of them go off back into reality again, and he goes around changing his ways. He tells people, look, I had a vision from God, I better change my ways. And then it always happens that there's a monk around and thinks, oh geez, I better write this all down. This is a vision from God, that we're going to save lives and stuff. That's and those kind of styles of writing is mostly around the Coptic writing that we see in Egypt, and the same style of writing reappears itself in Ireland. Now, eventually, obviously, that style of writing, because of the Golden Age of Ireland, when you have so many monastic teachers and stuff,
Right.
saints and scholars and all that, they then eventually make their way from Ireland back into Europe, and you can see that in the book, how the Irish saved civilization, or as the BBC renamed it, how the Celts saved civilization, wasn't it?
Right, Jesus.
Uh,
Yeah, so it's
so,
it's funny. You think about people always. This is something. So you're talking about the monks. People forget
mm,
that Christianity, especially in the first millennium, being much less delineated than it is at the start of the second millennium,
mm,
is there's lots of Christians in Africa, um,
mm,
and going
there
pretty
is.
far down into Ethiopia. And the thing
Mm,
about this era is you've got this big monastic movement, and I would honestly be surprised if there were not at least one or two, monks, very, very, very faithful, very not zealous because has a negative connotation. Monks, at least people from Africa who would come and seek a monastic life in Ireland, because this period Ireland is like the golden
mm,
place to go if you want to be part of the church
yeah.
and part of a monastic community.
Mm. Yeah, massively. Because at the time we had, with the fall of the Roman Empire, a lot of people dependent on the Roman Empire for day-to-day administration and literature and education and stuff. These cities, these settlements, the peak of civilization. And when you have these places like Londinia, York, the administration in there collapsing, people then, because the Irish had been taking note from the Romans for so long, they go off and they start building their own versions of cities, which were the monastic settlements. Now, it's heavily debated how much of a city, from an urban perspective, were these monastic settlements. However, they were at the time the Irish interpretation of what it was to be civilized, and that meant education. And you even get these churches are in the center of these cities. Debating on how urbanized it is, it's still what the Irish view as civilized. So the church is in the center of this
Right.
civilization, and so the priests, the monks, the scholars, the monastic people are inside the church, and so it's the center of education, the center of civilization, and so the Irish are building these monastic settlements all over Ireland, especially around the coastal areas, which later on, when the Vikings come in and take full exploit, and take full advantage of this, it brings an end to this kind of golden age that's happening in Ireland. However, just before the arrival of the Vikings onto the island, we do have people, as you were saying there, especially from England and Scotland and Pictland and stuff, coming from Britain into Ireland and even from Gaul, going to these monastic settlements, looking to be re-educated, and vice versa. You have people coming out of these monastic settlements and going out into the wider world and spreading the word of God. I have a picture there of Saint Brendan,
Yeah.
and he is so radical. Like at the time when we do eventually get a lot of these writings in around the 8th and 9th century, what's surviving anyway, it talks about that same literature that talks about Brendan also talks about Africa, talks about what was his name again, the Saint Hippo, and his connection with Africa and stuff. Um, while that's happening at the same time, very, very early on from Kerry, which is in the middle of nowhere, a few times I've turned around and like I love my Kerry friends and everything, like, but Kerry's considered, bog trotter territory. It's right out there. So every single time Kerry does something, we're all kind of like, and no offense to anyone from Kerry, like, we're all kind of surprised. And Kerry does a lot of stuff. Like even today, Kerry once again hits way past what it should do because we don't really expect much from Kerry because it's way out there in Irish society.
Poor
But
Carrie.
once again,
Aw.
I know. But it's true. Kerry's kind of like way out there on the edge of Ireland. So when you have somebody from the edge of Ireland at the very start of the Golden Age, St. Brendan, deciding one day he's going to spread the word of God, and doing exactly what Hippo told him to do a very long time ago. He's going straight out into Africa. Sorry, not Africa. Sorry, way out into Iceland, Greenland, and eventually making his way over to Newfoundland to spread the word of God. And he's going out to the very edges of the world. And that whole message goes back to this whole thing of spreading it to the very edges, which means that you do actually have Christians instead of, as you were pointing out there, you have members of the clergy purposely going to the edges of the world, such as Africa, even trying to push down to South Africa because they want to tell, even their imagination goes wild to what could be on the edges of the fringes, but they need to tell these people, hey, do you know about God? I need to tell you about God before you pass away because they think they're doing these people a favor. Like
Yeah.
they need to save their souls. God told them in the Bible they need to save their souls. And so you have people now tearing out into Vinland, which is modern day Newfoundland, out to the very edges of South Africa, then trying to push over to places like the edges of the Silk Road to tell these people, I need to save your soul. I need to tell you about God. So you
So
have
so
those connections during
so
the
would
Golden
you
Age.
would you did you find any evidence then of monks? Were there any writings, chronicles talking about monks going into what may have been called Ethiopia, even though Ethiopia was kind of like most of Africa to some people? Is there any kind of evidence of that, or of so-called Ethiopians coming back to Ireland?
Well, I don't know of any Ethiopians coming back to Ireland, but we do have members of the clergy going as far Chinese clergy. Sorry, I was supposed to say Chinese clergy. We do have members from Ireland. It's not until actually after the what was it? the Golden Age of Ireland, it's not until we go into the 12th and 13th century that we do have members of the Irish clergy pushing as far as going all the way down the Silk Road and pushing into what was it? Into China itself. And also going into North Africa and stuff. However, as we go into the Viking Age, we do actually, as you can see there in the coins, we do actually have people from both, because of the Iberian connection, Iberia connected with the Muslim world, the North African world. We
Oh.
do actually have people traveling from what was it, sub-Saharan Africa into North Africa, then from North Africa into Iberian, and then going into the Viking trade route, and then back up into Dublin. So it's not so much in, although there's talk of, and very possible, that we do have members of the clergy pushing into North Africa, it's not until then we go into the Viking Age that we actually have solid evidence of people, not so much. Of course, we do have Vikings pushing in to raid and attack, Irish Vikings from Dublin pushing in to raid and attack North Africa, West Africa. The solid evidence itself comes out of actually Africa coming into Dublin to trade. A lot of evidence that we can find is actually coinage, and we find loads of hoards, silver hoards, from Iberia and from Northwest Africa, from the Muslim world in particular, coming into Dublin and stuff. So that would be the solid evidence that we have. We also have literature as well, especially around the 9th century, of various bards coming in from the Iberian and North Africa, the Muslim world, coming into um, Dublin and serving various, both the Viking warlords, Turgus being one of the best examples, around 840. So 840, we do actually have a Muslim bard who comes into the Dublin Hall to serve
Oh.
for Turgus. And then later on, then we do have various characters coming in from the Iberian Muslim world to either trade or various other business. So there are people moving up in because of the Viking connection as we go into the economic golden age, as Claire Downham has said, and also John Sheehan. Um, just to be clear at this point, going from the Golden Age of Ireland, which was a golden age of the saints and scholars, it's mostly a golden age of literature. We have a transition period going into the Viking Age. And the Viking Age now, if you're looking at the likes of Claire Downham's work and John Sheehan's work, is actually an economic golden age, especially in Dublin, because it connects itself into this huge trade network going from Baghdad, which is connected into the Silk Road, from there, which we can see with the silk finds that are in
Right.
Dublin, because we have not only Vikings going into battle covered in Chinese silk, but we also have what was it? Women wearing kind of, oh God, you're going to correct me on this one. The head cover that goes onto their head to show that they're married. That's all full of silk,
Right.
Chinese
Yeah.
silk as well.
The wearing the
Um,
wimple and veil of silk. Yeah.
yeah.
It's
Uh,
and in fact in this it's one of the epics from this, the Irish epics from this Irish poems, because not really technically epics, I guess,
mm,
from this era, also talks about a woman in a green silk lena, which is
mm, mm,
interesting. So yeah, I you know I the whole Norse connection, the way the Norse trade routes connected the world, is often also forgotten. And the Norse
yeah.
were very fond of taking slaves. So,
Mm,
um, and you know, the slaves in this era, in the first millennium, most people don't realize are very multicultural. There's they come in all shades of people at this point. Um,
yeah, I think that brings up the biggest argument, because it was Alex that was actually on my channel that points out what was it? The wording. They actually used the solid wording for in Latin for West African people, that
ah,
they did encounter
nice.
Irish Vikings, well, men of Dublin, moving into the what was it called? They were raiding into the, that point, the Iberian point between, that's kind of a blur between North Africa and West
The
Africa.
Rock of
They
Gibraltar,
coincide
yeah,
there.
right.
Yeah, and Alex, who actually came onto my channel, I have a video, were the Irish Vikings black? It was something like that anyway. It, mostly clickbait, the title, but it's interesting because they talk about physically taking people onto their boats, and bringing them back to Dublin. And then there's, and they're using the Latin word for black, which is very, 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 very interesting. And then it kind of questions, okay, so what happens to these people afterwards and stuff?
Right.
Remember, God, when people seeing that word pop up on the YouTube video, jeez, you had people who were curious. They were very much like, okay, so where did these people go from there? Because you're in Africa, you're bound to bump into some anomalies and stuff. Um, within the wordings and stuff where you're questioning, you're, scratching your head going, okay, so who are these people? Where are they moving to? And I think
Right.
you should be questioning and stuff. And then you've got other people where they come across certain words, like the Latin version for West African and stuff. And they're like, no, that never happened, blah, 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 getting very aggressive about it. But I seen those comments pop up on my, that video I posted up. And
There are a lot of
I was
people
like,
whose
Jesus.
entire identities seem bound up in the color of the people who preceded them in their
Mm,
place of origin. It's very curious. I personally get excited at the thought that I'm not just as pasty pale as I look. Honestly,
mm,
I I get excited at the thought of sharing a broader heritage with the greater part of the world, but other people get very angry if you suggest that,
mm.
they're not pure Anglo-Saxon or whatever.
Yeah.
It's
That's a huge problem as well, and it's also down to interpretation as well. Because I've had people slap me in the face because I pointed out, you do know that people from Italy and the Middle East, they're not British Milky White. Like even the map that you have up there is a good example. Like Britain and Ireland, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Greenland. They're way up in the north. That our skin is like milky white,
right.
and people were kind of slapping me in the face, and they were just like, no, because people use the word milky white in Egypt and the Middle East. And I'm like, well, their interpretation is different to
Yep.
ours. So when they use the word milky white, they don't actually mean as milky white as us in Britain and
Yep.
Ireland.
They do not. Helen,
Mm,
fair Helen of Sparta was fair relative to everyone else in that part of the world. That didn't mean she looked like me.
mm,
So, yeah, you're right. It's also the way in modern day South Africa. The way they denominate skin color is very unique from an American perspective because they
yeah,
have white, they have black, and then they have what they call colored. And to black people, colored people can look white, but to white
yeah,
people, colored people never look white. So it's
yeah.
it's
My
all
my.
relative.
Mm. Yeah, I was saying this to you before as well when my granddad had gone over to Congo back in the 60s. And I'm not going to elaborate too much on the Congo and Ireland. Definitely well worth looking into. And when you start looking into Ireland and Congo, you'll suddenly realize why I'm not going to elaborate too much into
Dude,
that because
Congo was a
the
nightmare.
whole video will get,
Let's.
yeah, the whole video will get taken down if we elaborate into
Congo
that
was a
one.
nightmare. Let's
But
go moving away. Your
something,
grandfather.
yeah. Yeah. So something that kind of blew me away straight away is how people did to my granddad. My granddad, you have to now look at his interpretation of the world. He didn't leave Ireland. This is the first time he was outside of Ireland. So he was used to looking at people exactly like him in the 60s. So suddenly he's picked up by the Irish military and dumped in Congo after taking a few planes over. And he's suddenly bombarded from all these people who, to his eyes, and I don't want to sound bad or anything, they're all black. They're all black in his view. However, as he spent time in there and got to talk to people in English, they were pointing out, hey, look, I'm black. That guy is not black. And to him, that kind of blew his mind because to him, all of them were black. And the reason why I'm highlighting this is that he had a completely different interpretation of skin color
Right.
to the people who were considering themselves black. And then you had people who considered themselves, as you said there, of color in the Congo using a different terminology, um, who defining themselves differently.
Right.
So yeah, you're right. It definitely does go from the interpretation of where you are, from your geography point of view. And it's something that you just like want to highlight as well is that myself and Rachel are very conscious that a person from West Africa is of a different group to a person from North Africa, from Egypt. There are different groups, you know. So yeah, it's something I kind of want to highlight here and there because every once in a while it's different. You have to kind of take it from my perspective as well because I come from Ireland. I wouldn't really know, you know, the details of someone from what was it, Liberia or Egypt or
Right.
Nigeria and stuff. So when it comes down to the nitty gritty, I wouldn't be that much, wouldn't be the great, you know, most educated person of all when it comes down to the nitty gritty of all that. You know, I do come from an Irish perspective, but I'm aware that there's a huge difference between a person from Nigeria and a massive difference to a person that's in Egypt, you know?
Yeah, no, it's and you know, and as always, it's not even it's even more complicated than that because in Africa too, people move and people intermarry and have
Mm,
children that are not just Nigerian or just Egyptian, and you know,
mm.
over time those populations mix, and then you end up with,
Yeah.
you know, you end up with what many of us Americans are, which is 100% mutt. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's very true.
Right.
Um,
So, was there anything else? Anything else? Any other evidence? Because I didn't really know about those coins. The coins from Al Andalus that are
mm.
found in Ireland. That is a very very tantalizing tidbit for me. Is there
This
any
is
other
the
kind of
thing that
hard
kind of,
evidence?
yeah, this is the thing that always annoys me as well when it comes down to, and this is me bitching about Ireland again, is that we recently did a Cork, what was it? The Cork Museum. We recently did finds and stuff in, what was it, South Main Street. There was a big dig in South Main Street, and they wanted to show off all the finds of the medieval period. And so they went into the back of the museum and they took out a load of stuff from the Crusades and they just kind of shoved it into the corner to highlight Ireland's medieval history. And I was with my friend Shane Kent and I was going through each one of these finds. And he suddenly went, okay, and this is a, what was it called? A pin from Jerusalem. And I was like, what? This is a pin from Jerusalem? And he's like, yeah, it was a pin from the finds. And I was just like, wait. This is not highlighted as like one of the main things. It's just like shoved into the corner. And I'm like, okay, so where was it beforehand? Oh, it was just shoved into the back of the museum, just hidden away. And I'm like, oh my God, why is this not highlighted? Do you know, you're wondering why people are ignorant to a lot of this information
Right.
of connections between Ireland and the great what was it, Mediterranean world. It's because you guys don't advertise this fully.
It's you know
Um,
that's the work of a curator. Like literally, the word curator
yeah.
means to choose. So the curator
Mm.
should be doing a better job of curating the collection so that it shows the more rich panoply of history that is was this Cork you said that Cork has.
Yeah, where
It's
I'm from as well. Like,
it, yeah, it's it can be frustrating what museums have in the back or in the basement
yeah.
or in the attic.
Oh, I'm having the same bitching thing about the other Viking finds as well because there's Viking brooches in the English what was it, the museum
London
in London.
Museum
Yeah.
or
There's
Jorvik
two
maybe.
massively, they're absolutely gorgeous Dublin brooch finds for women. And at the time, somebody was asking me to go find a Hiberno Scandinavian brooches because we couldn't really find anything. So I went online, researched, and there was one in the London Museum. And I was like, okay, so this must be because this thing's beautiful. I was looking at this and I was like, God, it's so gorgeous. And then I found out it was buried in the back of the museum, and they didn't know exactly where it was in the back. And I was like, oh my God, what
Yeah,
are
it's
you doing? Like.
let me tell you, my recent research into 15th century Irish clothing has basically led me to hate Irish museums.
Oh,
It's so
it's
frustrating.
very bad.
I
Yeah.
have
And it's
more
like they
luck
can,
doing searches in Korean museums with my 4-year-old level of Korean than I do
mm,
on these Irish museum websites using their language, the language of their websites, which is English.
yeah.
It's
Oh, it's
frustrating.
diabolical.
Okay.
And then,
Oh,
yeah.
sorry. So,
Sorry.
is there anything? Because I actually do have a hard time hack to be out today because I have a train to catch at 11:10 my time.
Mm.
Um, so we're going to try to keep it a little more focused today than we usually do. Is there anything else about Ireland's connections with Africa? Because it's the connections, of course, the
Um,
Crusader connections are there. That's really important.
Yeah, you do have the picture up as well of the Book of Invasions, and
Right.
it's something that's become a hot debate lately, because a lot of people are using it as evidence that the likes of the O'Neills and stuff were black and stuff. The only problem I have with Hugh O'Neill being black is that we do actually have a painting, and he's milky white, he's as white as myself, and I'm not saying it's a bad argument. Most of the time when I come across these arguments, there's no real solid evidence about that. But he's using and debating with the Book of Invasions, which is actually a good source to use from. And once again, goes back to what I was saying earlier about St. Brendan. Um, the thing about the Book of Invasions is it does actually talk about the movement from Egypt going to North Africa, and then from North Africa over to Iberia, and then from Iberia up into Ireland. So it kind of highlights and reconnects that whole thing. But we also know of the Malaysians. So it talks about the Book of Invasions is basically the various groups from the Fall Bolga to the Malaysians moving from Iberia into Ireland, going from Africa, Iberia, Ireland, which we do actually have. These are end up becoming the various royal dynasties, the Over Kings, the High Kings of Ireland. Um, so it's very interesting, and we are starting to slowly but surely find archaeology evidence that supports the arrival of the likes of the Malaysians and stuff into Ireland. That we're finding the same archaeological finds in the Bronze Age in both Ireland and in the North Iberian. That we're starting to believe that maybe they were actually the same dynasty that's dominating. That some people are slanging the term Celtic Iberian Empire. No, if it was an empire, I have no idea, but it was definitely some form of a trade empire
Right.
going
Okay.
on in the Bronze Age. So even as far back as the Bronze Age, we're seeing a connection from Ireland into Iberia. And then when we look into the written sources like the Book of Invasions, that then is connecting from Iberia into North Africa.
Right.
And it's interesting that people are still writing about this and pushing it back to the Bronze Age, even as far as the early medieval period, when they're also writing about St. Brendan pushing up into Newfoundland at the same time.
That's really interesting because a lot of the various European in the 12th century, a lot of the European countries started countries by modern standards, but polities, various kingdoms started writing these
Mm.
histories that were very fond of connecting themselves back to Troy and
Yeah.
and to the fall of Troy, and either claiming a Trojan origin or a Greek origin.
Mm.
That was the whole English, the mythological English history was that Brutus, from Troy, fled Troy and came up and founded founded a kingdom in what is now the United Kingdom. three
Mm.
thousand years ago or something like that. So
Uh,
that's really interesting because that kind of ties in, I think, to that general movement of we want to connect
mm.
ourselves to the greater ancient world that came before
Yeah.
us, to these great cities of which we've heard so much in legend. So that's that. But
Mm.
but as you said, the archaeology is kind of pointing to that maybe not being as far fetched as it sounds. Now, obviously, it wasn't
Yeah, especially with Bronze Age,
right.
yeah,
It
because
wasn't necessarily Brutus or Aeneas, or
yeah.
that wasn't probably those people are absolutely mythological or legendary. But
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, I
Okay.
do believe that there is kind of some source going on with the Book of Invasions, but there definitely is rewriting going on. Because I remember John Kerry making the joke that the Irish had read the Bible, noticed that they weren't in it, and then wanted to connect themselves back to Moses and being like, hey, look, we were the chosen people too. Look, we branched away from Moses, walked from Egypt, but instead of going up into Israel, we decided to go the opposite way and go from North Africa then to Iberia, from Iberia up to Ireland. So there is a bit of a rewriting there. However, because we're now finding these Bronze Age finds between Ireland and the north of Iberia, perhaps in the Bronze Age there was an original version, but then as we were joking there, that when they go into the Golden Age of Ireland, they're looking at the Bible, they're looking at their original Book of Invasion book and thinking, actually, do you want to merge them two together? That way we can write ourselves into the Bible as well.
Yes. People, it's funny how important people's history and origins used to be, and now history is almost a
Mm.
completely ignored subject in certain places.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else about Ireland and its kind of, let me see what other. think we did. Did we? I've gone to the first screen. The I guess that was you're talking about the Bible. The connections to the Bible is probably the picture you sent of Mary and Joseph and Jesus in the manger. Um,
Yeah, yeah, and
oh,
that was
there's
just my
Arabic
connection with.
script up there. Look at that.
Yeah, yeah, that's
Oh,
what I mean by the Coptic influences and stuff,
oh,
that you can see that Coptic style, especially early on, how we have Coptic writing coming in from Egypt into the Mediterranean, and then from the Mediterranean into Ireland. So we do see that Coptic style in Ireland very early on and stuff. And then we have other evidence as well, like in Kerry, they're doing Byzantine crosses.
right.
Um, Highlighting the fact that so during the Golden Age of Ireland, we're seeing a lot of Byzantine symbolism and stuff. Even with the Book of Kells, the Book of Kells is very much kind of a very much Mediterranean and Byzantine influence. But then as we go into the Viking Age, um, I wouldn't really be the biggest specialist to know every single movement and change that happens in Mediterranean. However, there seems to be a domino effect where we have the Byzantine Empire that dominates the Mediterranean trade going into Ireland, and then suddenly there's a huge change going into the Viking Age where it's now a more Muslim, where we're getting coinage and stuff from Iberia, and that's
Yeah,
coming up in from North Africa. So we have those connections from North Africa into Iberia and then up into Ireland.
right.
So Ireland is very much connected into the Mediterranean, and surprise, surprise, North Africa is part of the Mediterranean world.
It's crazy, right? Which is actually a great segue for, which is why I kind of planned it this way, for us to go on to
Mm.
Spain, talking about the Iberian
Aye,
Peninsula, because
aye,
yeah, the thing that causes that big shift is basically the march of Islam across
mm,
the Middle East and across northern Africa, pushing all the way to Spain. That happens in the seventh
mm,
century, in the early seventh century, and it
aye,
causes a massive shift in the power and politics in the Mediterranean, and it's what kind
mm,
of
mm,
starts the shrinking of the Byzantine of the Eastern Roman Empire. So that's
aye,
that's that's where that shift comes from, because you go
mm,
from Constantinople being the dominating force basically, and even having reconquered parts of the Western Roman Empire under
mm,
Justinian, to Muhammad going and preaching his vision, and that just
mm,
converts that tens hundreds of thousands of people, and they convert in the most warlike way possible, and they
aye,
they sweep across northern Africa and carrying people in their wake and push up into the Iberian Peninsula and basically push the Visigoths
mm,
as were all the way up to the Pyrenees. So
yeah,
yeah, that brings us to Spain, which is it's always the exception in European history. And that's kind of why I
mm,
started here, because Spain, because of that Arab, that Middle Eastern, that Muslim connection, is highly, highly connected to not just Northern Africa, but Western Africa, specifically to
mm,
Mali. And that's really exemplified by this 14th century Catalan atlas. This is a close up of that picture. And that's Mansa Musa. That's Mansa Musa, the legendary
mm,
Golden King of Mali, and he was this was the time, the height of Mali's power, and you know his legend was so great that everyone in the Mediterranean world knew about him, basically because he had so much gold that he took this pilgrimage to Mecca via Egypt, and as he went across, he was just giving gold away, showering everywhere he went with gold, because they had their own gold mines, and
mm,
he caused a recession in Egypt, in
aye,
Cairo, because he brought so much gold. He flooded the market with gold, and it caused the price of gold to plummet. And he actually caused a
mm,
recession. So that's just how great the Kingdom of
Jesus,
Mali was. I mean,
aye.
talk about the ultimate flex. I caused a
Oh,
recession
it is
myself.
like, yeah. That so much came in at the time, it overwhelmed it. And this is
Right.
before you get into modern economic and finance, when people just talk as much as possible, and you don't see, sudden recessions kicking off like you would see today, because we've updated our economic and finance. This was a period when you filled your box as much as possible, and then just traded it, as you saw fit. But yet this guy overwhelmed the system so much, even messed up a medieval,
Yeah.
system. That's wild.
He crashed. maybe, I don't know if it's the first ever documented economic recession in history as we
Mm.
know it, but it's definitely an early one. Um,
Oh yeah, knock it down like.
so, and Timbuktu, what a lot of, unfortunately, Westerners don't know, or Europeans and Americans don't know,
Mm.
is that Timbuktu was this amazing library. It was a center of learning and knowledge, and had, manuscripts from all over Africa, from all over Europe, from all over the ancient, they had ancient manuscripts, probably many of which we don't have anymore because of the various burnings that have happened in the meanwhile. So, yeah, um, this Catalan atlas shows that in Spain they were well aware of what was happening, to the south of them, and may have even felt some of that recession themselves, as the value
Mm.
of gold plummeted thanks to Mansa Musa. Um,
Aye.
but so we have again, in Spanish you have the word negro, which literally means black,
Aye.
and it's doesn't have any
Mm.
of the connotations that it does in modern. When people we say Negroes in modern American English, it can be very problematic because of the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
But there have been people. The earliest sources from the Moorish invasion of Spain, talk about people who had very, 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 very dark skin, being
Mm.
amongst the invading armies who came in and swept their way northward. So it's very likely, it seems, that there have been, black people, black Africans in the Iberian Peninsula in some quantity, enough to be noted anyway, from the 7th century, the 8th century onward. So,
Yeah.
that's that's Europe. I don't care what anyone says.
Aye. It definitely is like we definitely have because you have that entire movement going in from the Middle East when we see this very start of Muhammad moving out from the Middle East into the Byzantine Empire and then up around Egypt with the Caliphate, moving into from Egypt into the wider North African world. And within that, then you can see that entire branch going into the wider African world,
Right.
which connects then from sub Saharan Africa, West Africa, even having Mecca between the Middle East and
Yeah.
the African world, and then that further connection into the Mediterranean, as you can see this big, massive Muslim invasion going into then Iberia, pushing out the Europeans out of Iberia, and then pushing into France, where you have that big, massive battle between, not seen as a kind of East versus West battle, but actually a Christian versus these, because at the time the Christians had no clue what was going on. To them, these were just these kind of heretic worshipping pagans that were tearing into. They had no clue about the fact that Christianity had branched off at this point in the Middle East. They were very ignorant to what was going on that side of the world. And you can see that even in the first writings going into the High Middle Ages in the 12th century, that sometimes they're writing it down as though they're fighting pagans and
Right.
heretics. They don't know, they haven't fully identified who they're fighting yet. And you can see that as
The
the
heathens, as they call
Caliphate,
them. Yeah.
yeah, the heathens, as the Caliphate is moving into France, the Franks have no idea what's going on as these people are tearing up from Iberia into France, where they have that big, massive battle in the 8th century where the Franks barely are able to push them back. And because the Saracens are literally pushing as far as they can, what happens is that they're what was it, their connection, which is their caravans, their cargo to support the military force itself, because that's so weak, because they had just pushed as far as they could, they have to actually push back to Iberia and
Right.
rebase themselves again before trying to push into the
Right.
Frankish territories again. And of course, then we're pushing into the era of Charlemagne, where Charlemagne has this huge renaissance and stuff.
Right.
But the reason why I'm bringing this up is that there is just this sudden boom switching from the collapse of the Roman Empire into the rise of the Caliphate, how it connects the wider African world into the Mediterranean trade connection, which you could definitely see as later on people who travel to Mecca will highlight the fact that you're dealing with people who were as I said earlier on, considered milky white all the way to black black. You can see that all at Mecca, which is centered between the African and Middle Eastern world.
Yeah, no, exactly. And here we have speaking of that, the pushback. So the Song of Roland, the Chanson du
Mm,
Roland, which many medievalists or people kind of peripherally familiar with medieval culture, or at least aware of, is all about
mm,
that battle, right? The
yeah.
pushback from Charlemagne to, not that that part didn't particularly happen, but legendarily, the idea was, that Charlemagne's great knight Roland goes at the Battle of Roncevaux and, pushes back the Muslims. And so
Mm,
that's, part of this idea that it came, and they talk about black Saracens being amongst those, and as I said earlier, that might have been their skin color, or it might have been referring to their morality, that they're heathens and
yeah.
therefore, basically demons until they become Christian. So we
Yeah.
even though the Song of Roland does talk about black Saracens, we can't really know whether they mean for them to literally be Africans who then
Mm,
become Europeans when they Christianize, or if it's just part of this morality of black equals bad, white equals good.
yeah.
Yeah, but what we do see as evidence of black people. This is here on the top right there. That's a 13th century illumination actually depicting two African slaves who have escaped and been brought back to justice. In I believe
Oh.
that's Aragon. That's King Jaume II of Aragon. And
Mm,
yeah, so even as of the 13th century, there were already black slaves in the Iberian Peninsula, but there were slaves of all colors.
mm.
I want to emphasize we're not into the African slave trade yet in the 13th century, the Atlantic slave trade yet in the 13th century. But,
Just to make this clear, because in from an Irish
Philip, are you there?
Oh, sorry. Just yeah, sorry, there's a bit of slowdown on my side.
Oh, right.
Just to make it clear, what's the story with the Iberian slave trade? Because in Ireland, the slave trade stops in 1103, and that's all forms of slave. There is no slavery after 1103 under the orders of the papacy. The papacy in Christianity is 100% anti-slavery after 1103 in Ireland. So that's not the same in Iberia.
Oh, it's not the same in Italy either. Yeah,
Okay, now
no.
that's
No,
interesting.
there are slaves throughout Europe that I don't I it's very interesting that the papacy puts the foot down on slavery in Ireland because that isn't true in other
Yeah, big
places
time.
in Europe.
Yeah.
And in Italy we have white slaves, we have Russian slaves. There are documents
Mm,
about slave women from Russia. There are slaves from Africa. There are black slaves. They don't necessarily call them African in the Italian sources, but they call them black. So yeah,
mm,
and of course Al-Andalus at this point in the 13th century, the Reconquista has started, and so the Christians are starting to push back, and they're starting to consolidate their power again, and push the Muslims further and further south. So Aragon has reestablished itself at this point, or established itself at this point, and there's a mix of
mm,
slaves. They have white slaves, they have black slaves, they have tan slaves. They also have
uh,
all of those in all of those peoples are also free people. So here's a book from Alfonso El Sabio's Book of Games. Um,
mm,
and here we have people of various colors, various ethnicities playing chess. You've got a woman over there to the right in a very interestingly translucent gown ensemble. But that could be because the pigment has kind of faded away. But on the other hand, the artist did take the time to draw her body under that. Um,
mm,
so these are Muslims that are being depicted here, but you definitely can see there's some very African, very sub-Saharan African features on some of these people here. So it's not just slaves at all in
yeah.
Al Andalus in this period. It's a very multicultural, very colorful place.
Mm,
But
mm,
we
mm, mm,
do, for certain, we have actual solid evidence. Of course, in the 13th century is that case in Aragon, and then in 14th century we start seeing more and more evidence of black slaves specifically. But that's still not the Atlantic slave trade. That's just, this is a period where there were raids for manpower, and that came in the form of slaves instead of illegal immigrants. Um,
mm.
and wars. Anytime there was a war or a battle, the losers were taken. Generally, they were captured and sold into slavery. That is
mm.
the reality of the slave trade in. That's a reality in most of the Western world for certain, most of Asia and Europe at this point, and probably in parts of the Americas as well. If you lose a battle, you're going to be taken into captivity. So we're
That's
still not
interesting.
into the the pure concentration of the Atlantic slave trade yet, but we're going to get there.
So is that a Mediterranean culture, this whole slavery and stuff? Because I maybe you can correct me on this one, but I'm just after 1103, both in England and my interpretation of France, maybe you can correct me on that one, and Ireland, there is no slavery,
Oh,
but
there's
there is
slavery
in
in England.
Mediterranean.
We'll get to that. There's even
Oh,
oh
okay.
yeah, one of the cases that we have is of an Ethiopian slave in the 13th century.
Ah,
Yeah, so there's
okay.
still maybe, and here's the thing: just because the Pope issues a bull or an edict in, say, the early 12th century doesn't mean that it stays in force or that everyone observes
Yeah.
it.
That's a very good point because we
Yeah.
do in Ireland, although I did say it's against the law in 1103, you still have people being kidnapped. Even in the Hundred Years' War, you have Irish people kidnapping French people, bringing them back to France, sorry, bringing them back to Ireland and putting them into forced labor unpaid, which is slavery, do you know?
Right. Yeah.
So we do have that going on. So yeah, yeah, from that interpretation, yeah, you do have that going on in Ireland.
So it's the word slavery can cover so many degrees of ownership, of
Yeah.
rights, of it's like slavery in the Roman Empire wasn't this anything like slavery in, say, the American colonies or the United States up until the Civil War, right? That there's
Mm,
the level of rights and legal uh, rights and abilities and freedom of movement was completely different. But we just kind of all have
mm.
one term to cover all those different degrees of slavery, and that's a failing of language that can lead
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah.
misunderstandings.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
yeah.
mm, mm.
So here we have, this is a Cantiga de. This is one of the many Cantigas de Santa Maria. This is 186, I think. Yeah, if I read the script, 185. No, 186. Sorry. This is number 186. There's 419 of these songs praising the Virgin Mary,
Mm.
but they're not just praising the Virgin Mary. These cantigas generally are like folk tales that are reframed around somehow praising the Virgin Mary for some miracle she ends up committing at the end. But in the
Mm.
meanwhile, lots of antics happen, often bawdy, often salacious, usually sinful. So it's a weird combination of a praise song plus a dirty folk tale. And
Hi, it's typical.
the one we have here that's actually so beautifully depicted in this kind of cartoon style, starting from the upper left quadrant, moving right and then moving down each level, is a body tale about a noblewoman, the daughter of a noble family who has a relationship with a black slave. And if you look at the way, let me
Mm.
see if I can, yeah. So you can see that this gentleman is indeed very, very dark. And if you look at his hair, it's tight and curly, right? These are very African kind of sub-Saharan African features, not just Arabic or North African Moorish. So she has this affair, and they get caught, of course, as they always do, by her family, and
Mm.
then they're taken to be executed. And she prays to the Virgin Mary, and and she repents, of course, and she prays to the Virgin Mary as they're
Always.
being burned alive, and the Virgin Mary saves her, but of course doesn't
Yeah.
save the heathen Moor, who you can see burning
Oh,
up in the flames there, sadly. So
yeah.
it's a triple morality tale, right? Don't have illicit
Mm.
affairs. Don't have illicit affairs with heathens. And if you're heathen, you should convert.
Yeah, yeah, I was just about to say that. Don't be a heathen.
Don't be a heathen.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. What you doing being a heathen?
Yeah, exactly. No matter how much it may be fun, don't be heathen.
Yeah,
No matter how
yeah.
tempting, don't be heathen.
Oh,
It's
aye.
it's I mean, it's such a quintessentially 14th century Iberian Christian idea, and not just Iberian Christian, just
Uh,
the main morality, the sex was bad, the illicit sex is bad. Sex for non-procreative purposes is bad, but the worst thing you can possibly be is heathen. So,
yeah. In
you
fact,
know,
just be a member of the clergy.
right, yeah. Although actually, the members of the
Oh,
clergy who got caught faced far less stringent repercussions than
oh yeah.
the people who weren't subject to ecclesiastical courts.
Oh
Sadly.
yeah. Mm,
So yeah. So this is again, this is evidence of slavery, of black slavery, but the evidence of that it was apparently common enough for you know for Christians of a more paler complexion to have relationships of a sexual nature with people of a very not pale complexion.
mm.
So, that when you write a story about it, it's probably kind of a common enough thing that you end up writing what is supposed to be a funny slash tragic slash scary story. It's a weird combination.
Sure, don't you see the same thing in Shakespeare's Othello as well?
Oh
Like,
yeah, Othello. Yeah, whew. Talk about
yeah.
a talk about a heavy play.
Oh, I.
that is that is we're not there yet. That is a heavy play.
Oh, I.
So what's interesting is I found some evidence from Valencia, actually, 15th century Valencia, which is on the east coast of. Let's see if I can get to the map here. Which is on the east coast of Spain, kind of in the center of the east coast of Spain. You can see Spain here in the bottom, sort of middle, divided by those two that fold there. And Valencia had, for certain, it had black slaves because we actually have records, law records, talking about black slave women, and slave is in quotes again, using
I.
the law to assert their rights against their owners in 15th century
Ah.
Valencia, which is very, it's very interesting to illustrate that slavery in 14th, 15th century Spain wasn't the same, definitely was not the same as it was in the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries. Because, there were no
Mm.
rights. There is literally nothing you couldn't do to a slave in America in that era. But in Valencia, apparently, not only did they have black slave women, the black slave women were savvy and knew how to use the law to their advantage.
It's a lot similar to the Viking Age laws and stuff. Now, don't get me wrong, they're clearly abusing it in Dublin, but because Dublin was under the Brehon laws, there are actually laws for a slave. For example, if you get your slave pregnant, she becomes then a free man and takes on the same status as what should be yours. Now, don't get me wrong, at the same time, it's quite clear that Dublin completely abuses that. In fact, the
Right.
Over King of Ireland in 980, Mael Shocknall II, goes into Dublin. He has to physically take Dublin because at the time the King of Dublin isn't paying his full tribute of cattle. And so he marches into Dublin. They get into the fight, the Battle of Tara in 980. The King of Dublin loses that. Mael Shocknall II bursts and breaks into Dublin, and he's completely disgusted at how slaves are treated in Dublin. So the reason why I bring that example up is to highlight the fact that slaves were massively abused, and
Right.
the Dublin Vikings were breaking the law at the treatment of slaves in
Oh,
Dublin. So although there's laws there, the Dublin Vikings and most likely other tutas and urban settlements in Ireland are abusing and breaking those laws.
right. That's
Mm.
that's that's really that's really interesting. I wonder if did the slaves have any recourse? Could they did they
Well,
do what
Mel,
these women in Valencia did and seek the law?
the problem is that a lot of the times they were completely locked away. Like they had these people in isolation, and we know this
Oh,
because leprosy broke out.
oh,
And if you look at the skeletons of these poor women who were objectified, it's quite clear that they were put into small little boxes and cages and stuff. Which is completely against the Brehon law. So these women were completely abused and objectified, and we know that from the bones that were found,
ah,
um,
that's
and
horrifying.
various other signs. Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah, and the way
amazing.
that they
It's
were
amazing
confined.
what humans can do to each other. Really, just the ability
Mm,
to other and completely divorce oneself from one's fellow man and then commit atrocities.
wild.
It's
Mm,
So I've got here the famous. This is the Baroque modern day as it looks now. The cathedral in Santiago de Compostela, and this Saint James, the Mato Moro, the Moor killer. Um,
Mm,
and what's interesting about this, the reason I have this is because there is a record from the 14th century in Spain that records from the cathedral in the church records that records all the nations, in quotes, nations. Nation is a slightly different idea. It's more about your people, your ethnicity, your tribe, rather than any kind of polity. But it records a
mm.
list of 74 nations of the pilgrims who make the pilgrimage to, one of the most famous pilgrimage sites in Christianity, Santiago. And amongst these 74 nations, it includes Nubia.
Mm.
And Nubia is known for its black people. And
Ah.
what the Europeans considered to be Nubia was kind of like three actual kingdoms in the 14th century, three different kingdoms. But
Mm.
of course, medieval geography is terrible, so they just called it
Yeah.
Nubia because that was the ancient Roman term, the ancient Roman term for it.
Ah.
So we know that there were Nubians, possibly also people from what is now modern, most likely, in fact, from Ethiopia, and I'll get to that later, who were making the pilgrimage all the way through to Santiago de Compostela. And
Mm.
these pilgrimage routes are also often ignored as a possible connection that connected Europe to not only Africa but Asia as well, because a lot of people forget about non-mercantile interconnections that existed, and pilgrimage was a
Mm.
big part of medieval Christian life. And that was whether you were, Eastern Church, Western Church, Ethiopian Church, the Nestorian Church out in Asia, didn't matter. They all had this tradition of pilgrimage, and each other's pilgrimage sites were considered mutually holy.
Mm.
Especially the original, I'll call them the original sites, the sites belonging to the apostles and Jesus. Those were particularly holy to everyone. St. James was one of the two Jameses who followed Jesus, and
Mm.
he, very, very important site of Christianity to this day. People are still making
Mm.
that pilgrimage from France all the way across northern Spain to Santiago. People from all over the world. So,
Yeah, I think it was you that covered the Irish connection between both Spain and Ireland, but we also have the pilgrimages as well. The problem with the word pilgrimage in Ireland, though, is that it's very difficult to see which ones are actually going for pilgrimage or which ones are going for crusading,
yeah.
because we do have people going from Ireland to pilgrimages to Santiago, but sometimes are just identified with the Iberian pilgrimage. But the problem is that they could be connecting themselves with the Scottish and then going into, especially the 13th and 14th century, when you have the Scots crusading into Iberia, they perhaps were jumping in, especially the likes of the O'Neills and stuff. Maybe not going to Santiago when they say the word pilgrimage, but maybe pushing in to fight the
Right.
Iberians and stuff.
As part of the Reconquista, yeah. That is
Yeah.
that is funny you mentioned that. So yeah, it's in some chronicles they say they're going on pilgrimage. You're absolutely right, but what they really mean is they're going to go kill some people in the name of God. So
Yeah, it's wild because I see that with the when they were doing the First Crusade and the Norwegian Crusade, and specifically those two ones. I was reading away. I was innocent to the word pilgrimage, and I was like, "Oh, they're going to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem," and I was like, "What? What do you mean they're going? That Jerusalem is not safe. They should not be going over there." And then they attached themselves onto the Crusade, and I was like, "Wait, are they going out to commit deletion of people?"
yes, that is correct. Yep,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it is. So this again, this underscores the difficulty of language and not using terms in a consistent
Mm,
way that can lead to historical confusion.
yeah.
So that kind of brings us to the 1440s, is when the Atlantic slave trade really kicks off.
Mm,
And that is because the Portuguese have struck out into the world. They have ships that are more advanced than ever on the European side of things, and they have decided that they are going to go as far as they can to get to India, and along the way is West Africa. And
mm,
manpower is always an issue. Slavery was not new. The Portuguese did not invent slavery at all, as we've discussed. but they start setting up trade posts all along West Africa, and they start trading in slaves. So they're not.
Mm.
This is there's a misconception that it was a bunch of Portuguese going and raiding slaves. No, no, the slaves were being captured in conflicts usually further afield than the coast, and being brought to the ports to be traded as goods
Mm.
by their fellow Africans. So it's not, in this period, it's not a question of massive white European incursions into Africa. That's not what's happening yet. But this is the
Mm.
point. For the 1440 is about the turning point where we start seeing a massive influx of black Africans into Europe. And so the historical record suddenly explodes with evidence of black people living in Europe from the 15th century onward, which is the period of Kingdom Come Deliverance too. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. um,
We're not quite. Do you think so? Obviously, because Bohemia is stuck between the rise of the Ottoman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire, that's why we can see that connection between Africa to the Ottoman Empire, and then people being stuck in the middle of the Balkans. And then we can see ourselves, our Mali friend, popping in from the Ottoman Empire into Bohemia. Do you think then in the High Side Wars, when we go to 430 in the video game, the third one, you think then we'll start to see African slaves in Bohemia?
so it's I'm not certain about the slaves so much, but I do have a little section on Bohemia, and we'll get to that because
Okay.
it kind of caps off the thing. But the Ottoman Empire was also very, very multicultural and very colorful, and the
Mm.
sultans had entire black regiments is not the right word, smaller units than that, but they had
Or the retinue?
entire units of black Africans. They talk about them, and they're depicted in
Mm.
Ottoman art from the 15th century, 14th and 15th century going forward. So the proximity of Bohemia to the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century means it's likely that Bohemians would have at least seen people of color.
Yeah, yeah.
Were there massive numbers of them? We'll get to that, but the
Mm.
occasional interaction is not beyond the realm of possibility. And that brings us back to the idea that the sources don't necessarily always focus on the color of a person's skin in the Middle Ages. Sometimes they do, but it's not consistent. It
Mm.
depends. It depends on the chronicler. It depends on whether they were fascinated by it or not.
Yeah, that's true. I know it catches the people of Bohemia off guard when they see a man from Mali, but when you are playing as Henry and you go up and just blatantly ask him, "What are you doing in Bohemia?" His story makes perfect sense. He's a man that went from Mali to, God, the bloody word just came completely out of my head. Where all the Muslims meet up.
Mecca.
What's it called? Mecca. Yeah, he went from Mali to Mecca, which makes perfect sense because they have to go there and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the
And then
Hajj.
from
Yeah.
there, he connected himself into the big, massive Ottoman trade routes and stuff into the Mediterranean. From there, he wanted to go off to Venice. He went off to Venice because he's a part of that trade network. From there, he goes back over to Constantinople.
Right.
And it's from Constantinople that's how he ends up eventually getting himself into Bohemia because he goes into the front lines between the fighting between the Ottoman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire that's starting to build up at the time, especially with King Sigismund and the Ottoman Empire. And he falls into King Sigismund's court, and eventually that's how he ends up in Bohemia because King Sigismund is also advancing into Bohemia and into the German states at the time. That's how he gets caught up, which makes perfect sense.
Right. No, it's not implausible. If they
Yeah,
if every character in Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 had suddenly been from Mali, I would object.
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
but having one single Malian trader, no, that's not beyond the realm of possibility. Of course, at this point, Mali
Mm.
is on the decline. But by that point, by the early 15th century, every empire rises and falls, and Mali
Mm.
reached its zenith and had already started collapsing at this point, but it wasn't gone yet. It was still a going concern, and Timbuktu was still a going concern. So
Mm.
it's not beyond the realm of possibility that the very still wealthy kingdom of Mali would have had traders going out and definitely going on Hajj,
Mm.
and possibly deciding to take advantage of this new up and coming empire, the Ottoman Empire.
Mm, mm, mm.
So let me just check the questions. Emperor of Ethiopia is supposedly a descendant of King Solomon. Yes, and the Queen of Sheba. Yep. Ethiopia has a very interesting origin story. And it's more interesting because it's not, there's actually some real history and archaeology to back it up. But that's pre-medieval, so we're not going to go there. But yeah, that definitely shows potential connections in the ancient world, in the ancient biblical world, even between Africa and the Middle East, for certain.
Mm.
Okay, so let's move on to England. The England,
Go on.
yes.
Aye.
Yeah. So the connection. England gets a there is a possibility that because of the Norse trade routes, there may have already been black Africans in England as an occasional slave at this point. It's possible.
Yeah.
I did not dig hard into pre-conquest. I did not dig at all. Actually, let me be honest. I did not dig at all into pre-conquest sources because this is such a large subject and I wanted to touch a little bit on different places.
Mm.
But for all I know, there might be something in the chronicles pre-conquest that talk about, black people, dark-skinned people, Africans, Blackmoors. The term Blackmoor actually would post-date that would come after the Crusades. So not Blackmoors, but some other term that might have been used pre-conquest, being the William the Bastard's conquest. I mean, um,
Yeah.
I don't know, but it feels likely considering those trade routes that we talked about between,
Well,
in the Norse
the
world.
realm of possibility comes in when it comes on to the Norse world, especially moving into the Hiberno-Scandinavian period of the 10th century, where Claire Downham talks about the economic golden age that's happening, which is the connection between the Mediterranean world, which connects at this point the Caliphate
Right.
into what was it called? The Hiberno-Scandinavian trade route from Dublin into the Mediterranean, where they are trading with various traders there. Now, the Irish Vikings are purposely trading their white, pale women on purpose as slaves because they're making so much money. So we are aware that they are trading them because the Muslim world loves pale women, so they make a lot of money.
They do,
Now, is
yeah.
it happening? Yeah, is it happening the other way around? Is debatable. Are they purposely trading black people to go back to Dublin and show them off as a kind of like, hey, look, I have something of really unique status here. Dress them up in all kinds of outfits and stuff is in the world of possibility.
Right.
But I've got no evidence of people actually doing that, where they're purchasing, as black as they can purchase and then bringing them back to Dublin. And then because of that, then at the time, you did have the Hiberno-Scandinavians under Sihtric and Ragnar Eomer, who then take over York. The Irish Vikings physically take it over around 920. They physically take over York and add it into the Scandinavian trading world. So whatever was connected in Dublin was also connected in York as well.
Right. Yeah, it's and that's I want to emphasize, like you said, I haven't looked for, and
Mm.
therefore haven't found the documentary evidence, but within the realm of possibility that there were indeed people of various various colors in England before the conquest. But the Crusades is what really opens up the eyes of many people from England, whether French, whether Norman or Anglo-Saxon in origin. They all converge upon they all converge upon Jerusalem, and of course, then they all become Franks in the eyes of the Arabs. Of the
Hi.
then everyone is a Frank, no matter where they're from, whether they're from the Iberian Peninsula or Italy or France or Germany or England. They're all Franks as far
Hi.
yeah as far as the Muslims in the Middle East are concerned. And this is the point
Civilized
at
France.
which we start seeing um, a definite documentary change, evidence of multi ethnicities starting to inhabit England. So we
Mm.
actually have this guy Richard of Devise. He's pretty judgmental. He's this fascinating description of London in the 12th century. Um,
Mm,
and he doesn't, he very much, you can tell he's not fond of London. And he says, I want to read
mm.
this into the record because it's great. He says, "You will come to London. Behold, I warn you, whatever of evil or of perversity there is in any way, whatever in all the parts of the world, you will find in that city alone. Go not to dances of panders, nor mix yourself up with the herds of the stews. Avoid the talus and the dice, the theatre and the tavern. You will find more braggadocios there than in all France, while the number of flatterers is infinite. Stage players, buffoons, those that have no hair on their bodies, garamantes, pickthanks, catamites, effeminate sodomites, lewd musical girls, druggists, lustful persons, fortune tellers, extortioners, nightly strollers, magicians, mimics, common beggars, tatterdemalions. This whole crew has filled every house. So if you do not wish to live with the shameful, you will not dwell in London." So
Huh.
I this is chef's kiss in terms of judgmentalism, and very clearly a French bias, because yeah, Richard de Devise was a Norman knight,
All right.
and what's the word that I want everyone to focus on is garamantes. So
Mm,
Garamantia was the ancient, it was the Latin word, it was the Roman word for what is now Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria, that region of Africa. And
mm, mm.
so the Garamantes were people who had identified themselves or were thought to come from that part of Africa. And we have this gentleman talking about these people inhabiting London in large enough numbers that he should complain about them.
Hi.
Now, were they black African? Were they more Berber, sort of, caramel? We don't know. But the thing is that that part of Africa to this day is not just one is not just one race as we understand race of people. It's a very multicultural, multi-ethnic place. And I imagine that
Mm,
was
mm,
true
mm.
then because the trade routes going across the Sahara were possibly even were more active than they are now. So
Mm,
yeah, these Garamantes who are inhabiting 12th century London could well have been black Africans, but they were definitely Africans of
mm.
some type for certain,
That's fascinating.
right? Now I'm pretty certain they weren't slaves because usually one doesn't complain about slaves
Mm,
because they don't generally have the freedom to ruin a place, as apparently all of these different groups seem to be doing to London. Yeah. So if anyone has any questions about those terms, because there's a lot of interesting words up in that on the screen right now, pop them in the chat and we'll
mm,
get to
mm.
them. Um,
Oh, definitely.
but that kind of brings us to the next the next instance. So we have in the 12th century also from 1160 to about 1164 this gentleman is mentioned in not London but Wiltshire. Wiltshire is not exactly what I would call the most connected part of England, the
Yeah,
most
hi.
metropolitan part of England as was. But in the Wiltshire pipe rolls, there is this legal record of this gentleman called Mahomet the Duelist. And,
Oh.
and he is charged with dueling and dueling with an English nobleman, and they are each fined a, 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 a different amount of money, which is
Mm-hmm.
interesting. Muhammad is charged less than the English nobleman with whom he has been dueling. And I think he's charged not pounds. Pounds is not the currency of this time. Damn it, shillings. Three
Oh, yeah,
shillings.
yeah, yeah. Shillings, aye, aye.
3 shillings, and the English nobleman with whom he's been dueling is charged 7. And
Is that down to the fact that the reason why the Englishman is charged more because he should know better? Because I know the same thing happens in Ireland where native Irish people get charged more than foreigners. And it's a case of they should know better. Like for example, the men of Dublin get charged far more than their Norse mercenaries. So when a Norse or Danish mercenary person comes in, sometimes it's just completely forgiven. It's like, well, you're a foreigner, you don't know any better,
right.
go away. But if an Irish Viking, Oostman, or a Gaelic man is caught doing the same thing, he's heavily fined or punished because, and it says that in the book of Oshrga, he should know better. Do you
Mm.
know? Is that the same case?
So there's no one knows, no, and I
Mm,
think that feels like a right answer because it's not noted in the rolls why, and there doesn't seem to be anything in the laws about, well, if a you know a citizen of Wiltshire, I don't know what they, a denizen of Wiltshire commits a crime,
mm.
then they shall be fined more, and if it is a foreigner, then they shall be fined less. I don't think that's written into the laws at this time, but that seems like a pretty likely answer. Another theory
Okay.
is that is it's a question of who won and who lost the duel, or not
Oh,
even who won or lost. Sorry, who started it. So
okay. Well, that
that
makes sense.
that the person who started it in this case may have been the English nobleman, and ergo he is at more fault than the man who's just defending himself. So it could be both either of those. It could be both of those. Maybe both things were taken into consideration in the levying of the fine. But what's really interesting about this case is that Mahomet is not there just for 1160. He's recorded as making payments on this fine for a period of 3 years. And,
Oh,
and the very last record indicates that he will not be able to pay the rest off, indicating that maybe he left. And that was recorded in the rolls.
oh, okay. That's fascinating. So he was kind of like, good luck to you, goodbye.
Yeah, right. It's like, well, I tried, but I'm just a Mahomet. I can't, I don't earn
Exactly.
shillings, or I'm not, or he probably pleaded poverty, but the reality is he probably just decided not to pay it all.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was just like, okay, I'm jumping back to
I'm,
France now.
I'm,
Good
I'm
luck,
out of here,
bye.
man. But
Yeah,
the
yeah,
reason
yeah,
this man I think is here in the 1160s is because of the Crusades, and because
yeah.
Jerusalem at this point is 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 under, let me see, the second crusade happens in the 1140s, the third crusade happens in 1189.
Yeah.
Jerusalem, I think, is back in Christian hands at this point.
Mm,
um,
mm.
so there's the trade routes have definitely, just the sluices have opened in that regard, and the movement of peoples, I think, is definitely getting a lot heavier. And that could be Muhammad could have been brought back as a so-called slave and maybe just ended up finding his way to liberty, or maybe he was brought back as a travel companion. The
Sounds like a nut job.
Yeah, right. Well, if you're dueling,
Well, yeah,
that's
that's what
a
I was about to say.
that's an honorable pastime in the 12th century.
Yeah, I was about to say that as well. He's definitely not in the freeman or what was it, serf level. He's definitely up in the baron level if he's called the duelist
Yeah.
because lessons of if you've ever done HEMA or done any form of high standard martial arts, such as the sword martial art, first off, you need the sword. Secondly, you need a teacher of a high status to teach you that. So
Yeah.
to earn the title, and he's got the title the duelist, which
Yeah.
highlights the fact that this man is not just highly educated in the martial arts, but has a good bit of money behind his backing. Like
Yep.
because he has to be able to maintain the swords as well and all of his equipment. So the duelist is highlighting the fact that he does have a sword of high status at the time, multiple swords of high status,
Yep.
and on top of that, if he's got a sword like that, then he's got an entire kit of
Yeah.
weapons for
And he
fighting in
doesn't
these
and he
big,
doesn't
massive
die,
wars.
right? He survives.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah, he survives at least 3 more years. Oh, maybe,
yeah,
I
yeah,
guess
yeah.
maybe he did finally die in a duel, and that's why he vanishes from the record. But he vanishes from the records after that. We don't know what happens to him.
Yeah.
But your point is
Because
absolutely spot on. If he's dueling,
yeah,
that's not he's not a serf, he's not a slave, because if he'd been a slave and had attacked a free man or a nobleman, that would have been bad. That probably would
exactly.
have that would have
Yeah.
had that would have had nasty, unpleasant, and mutilating consequences for him, probably.
Yeah, he's definitely part of a family of, that owns land somewhere. Is definitely funding him. Someone's
Yeah.
definitely funding him anyway. Like,
He's yeah, somewhere in the world. He is
yeah,
of the privileged class. Yeah. What's
yeah,
interesting, so the picture on the right is not Muhammad the duelist. I just want to be clear. But
okay,
this is an interesting illuminated initial in a chronicle from Derbyshire, from the 13th century. So it's a little bit later than the 12th century, but not much. It's probably about 50 or 60 years after this incident in 1160. But if you look at this person, this is not just a typical European whose skin has been painted black to represent a black person. The features are very black African, the tight curly, the kinky hair, the features. It's not just what I call a blackwashed white person, which you do see in art. You can almost always tell which of these artists, these miniaturists, saw the subject matter that they were depicting. You could tell if they ever saw an elephant or just heard it described badly. Okay. Same thing with people of different nations in the medieval concept of nations. You can nearly always tell if they saw a person from that place or if they were just depicting their imagination. And this representation here, especially for the standards of 13th century figure depictions, is a pretty plausible representation of someone from sub-Saharan Africa, in my view.
yeah. It definitely looks it to me.
Right?
Or
Yeah.
that's just my interpretation one either.
I mean, it's art. It can be tricky to use it as prima facie evidence of anything, to be honest.
Mm.
But
Oh
still,
yeah.
it seems indicative that this artist had seen someone from that part of the world. And look how nicely he's dressed. Look at those hosen, so swanky, all patterned
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah,
everything.
definitely. So it's definitely the thing because we're dealing with the connection from Mali into North Africa and then from North Africa into Iberia and the Middle East. It's a case of we're not looking at people with black skin as low status. We're in fact looking at them from a high status perspective because first off, obviously traveling from Mali to North Africa and into Iberia would have costed a bit of money. So we're dealing from the barring class upwards. And then on top of that as well, Mali at the time it does have a lot of gold. So is it a case of in the medieval period when they did see a black man, not a man from North Africa, not a man from Egypt? No, we're talking about a black man here now from Mali. They would have seen more of a high status interpretation rather than a low status that we have in the 15th century.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. This definitely predates the era of that kind of racism. The racism of this era is, or tribalism. I'm going to go with the word tribalism. Is more: are you Christian
Okay.
or are you not? are you are,
Oh
are
yeah.
you Christian or are you heathen? That's the tribalism that really dominates in this era. So black
Mm.
Christians are given, as far as I can tell, based on the chronicles, just as much respect when they go on pilgrimage as white Christians are. Right?
Mm.
It's about it's about your church, not your point of origin so much. And in fact, for many people, when you read these chronicles, when they encounter someone from one of these really exotic places, they're viewed almost with this marvel, this positive marvel,
Mm.
not a negative level of marvel. Now, Mahomet, we don't know if he was from North Africa or from Mali or from the Holy Land. We don't know. There's no indication of that. But he's very clearly Muslim, and Islam
Mm.
in this era covers all of those possibilities in terms of geographical point of origin. But for certain,
Yeah.
he is not Christian, and I would be very surprised if his skin were as white as the Englishman whom he was dueling.
Yeah, but even the level of respect that he's referred to as Muhammad of the duelist,
Right.
he is, as we've pointed out like a million times,
Yeah.
but even the fact that he's connected to educated people, you're dealing with a connection of people who are both reading literature and they're massively into the martial arts of the sword, that perhaps maybe that's how he ends up in England, that you
Yeah.
had a baron who's also very good at martial arts in Jerusalem, bumped into this guy who was a Muslim. They both educated each other, and this guy's just like, "You need to come back to England with me. Come on, that's what could have happened."
Right.
You're dealing with two, fellas who are in love with the martial art. They don't care about religion, and then
Right.
this guy's like, "Come back to
Bro-
me. I have other people who think like us. Let's go."
brothers in
Who
arms,
knows?
right? One of the
Yeah.
biggest things that has bonded so-called enemies for centuries, you know.
Yeah.
I
Is the love of
absolutely
martial
agree.
art, yeah.
And you know, at this point, people, people from Mali were known for traveling really far afield. People from other parts, Ethiopia, as we understand it, but also Ethiopia in the medieval sense, which was a much bigger part of Africa, definitely traveled. The Middle Eastern Muslims, the Arabs, they were very known to travel far. So it would absolutely make sense that you encounter a fellow, this crusader, maybe in single combat. You end up,
Yeah.
it comes to a draw, and then the Englishman says, or well, the Frank says, "Come back with me to my estate. Let us go and be brothers in arms together." Meanwhile,
Yeah,
Muhammad's
exactly.
like, "Yeah, I'm getting
Yeah.
bored just in this castle. Let me go and challenge some people."
Yeah, 100%. That's what I'm assuming happened here, that these two lads bumped into each other around, most likely, probably Jerusalem or something, and then from there. But the point still stands is that we do have people getting in contact with other barons, other nobles, talking to each other, and then being like, okay, I'm going over to England and Dublin and stuff. That makes sense,
Yeah,
especially if you have the money to do so. Like,
absolutely. So
mm,
moving on to my first official reference to a most likely black slave in England comes from the patent
mm,
rolls of Henry III, actually. So we're talking about the 13th century now,
um,
so mid 13th century. Specifically, this dates to 1259, and
mm,
this refers to um, a gentleman who is called
mm.
Bartholomew the Ethiopian. And I want
Oh,
to just briefly recap. Ethiopia in this era encompassed what we think of as Ethiopia, but also a whole lot more of Eastern Africa, Eastern and sort of sub Egypt, south of Egypt Africa. And sometimes
mm,
Ethiopia also included what we think of as India, and sometimes India, the term India, included what we think of as Ethiopia. So, with that in mind, um, coming from Ethiopia in this case could very well mean that he is sub-Saharan African. It could also mean that he is from India, but I think that's less likely in the 13th century, the India part. I think it's more likely he's from kind of East Africa, Central East
okay.
Africa.
Mm,
But
mm,
what's interesting is this is a announcement of that the slave Bartholomew has escaped and that they would like him back. And the wording is also interesting. It says, "The king to all men greetings, etc." Because there's
mm,
all these frilly titles that should come after that, but they just the scribes like etc. Just forget it.
mm, mm,
As a certain Ethiopian named Bartholomew, formerly a Saracen slave of our dear and faithful Roger de Linton, whom the same Roger brought
mm.
with him to England, has secretly taken himself off from his lord, and Roger has sent his esquire to search for him. We order you, if it happens that the said Ethiopian is found somewhere in your bailiwick or area of authority, to have him arrested, and if he is found somewhere in your and to have him arrested and delivered to the same esquire for the benefit of the aforesaid Roger, his lord.
Huh.
Yeah. So sorry, that was a terrible cut and paste on my part. So on the maker of my PowerPoint, on my tech guy's part.
Oh no, it's grand.
Anyway, so there's some really interesting details here. Formerly a Saracen slave. So it could be that he's formerly a Saracen and still a slave. Formerly a Saracen, formerly a slave, or
Mm,
just, formerly a slave and still Saracen. So the the options there for the meaning of that particular phrase is kind of nebulous. And I didn't go back and look
mm,
at it's
mm.
written in Latin. I didn't go back and look at the original Latin. Mea maxima culpa I meant to, and I just realized that I meant to and I didn't, because the Latin might actually is probably more clear in
Mm.
what exactly they mean when they say formerly a Saracen slave, because they're clearly still looking for this guy, and he's still considered
Yeah.
in some way to be bound to Lord Roger de Linton.
Okay. And what's the story? Do you know what's the story with slave laws in England? Did he just go out of his way and kidnap this person and is keeping him as like some form of human pet? or is there actually a law and system in place for Roger, or is he just abusing this other human being? Like, what's going on here? Like,
I mean, yeah. So it seems I wasn't actually able to find so much clarity on that particular topic,
yeah,
but it seems that because serfdom is still a fully fledged institution at this point,
yeah,
um, that the idea of people being bound to other people in a form of forced servitude is absolutely a thing. So and the way this reads exactly like the sort of proclamations I see for serfs that have escaped. Like it
oh, okay,
reads almost exactly the same way. So I feel like he's being treated like a kind of serf in this case. And if you all
okay,
hear that
that makes
bell, that's
sense.
my handsome. Could you please take the bell from the cat? My cats have decided it's time to play bell soccer. Apparently,
Mm.
it's that time of day. So yeah, I'm pretty certain that it feels to me that he is probably being treated in the same way that serfs would be treated if they had escaped in this era.
Okay,
And this is
that
also a
makes sense for
time.
the 13th century. Yeah,
This is a time when the cities were developing into places where if a serf could make it to the city, they would be granted franchise, meaning freedom.
ah, I did
Yeah,
not know that.
yeah. So this is the time when that's shifting, and so that's why it's kind of particularly important for masters, for lords, for the slave owner in this case, to catch their chattel, as it were, before they make it to one of those cities. Because if they
Yeah,
make
yeah,
it to
yeah.
one of those cities, then hypothetically they should be granted franchise. They should be granted freedom.
Oh, yeah. So they're putting this in the status of a free man or free woman. Okay, that makes
Exactly.
perfect sense. So it yeah. So he's more of a serf rather than he's basically an abused human or a slave. Because I know in Ireland at the time, we not only do we have serfs, but we do have people kidnapping other people and then putting them into forced labor and stuff, which is completely against the law. And there is a difference between a serf and a person that's been kidnapped and put into forced labor, or in some cases for poor women, abused in that kind of
Right.
way.
I know for a fact that crusaders were returning with slaves all the time. It's
Oh yeah.
common fact. It's
Okay.
mentioned in the chronicles often, and sometimes you find references. You do find more references. I wanted to keep this presentation, contained, but if I just went into the topic of all of the so-called Saracens that were brought back to England in the wake of the Crusades, I could write a encyclopedia length book. That's how common it was. Um, you know,
Mm.
and the fact that he's called both an Ethiopian and a Saracen tells me that this author is focusing on the Saracen part as him being Muslim, and the Ethiopian
Mm.
part is his point of origin. So
Okay, that's
that
fascinating.
indicates again the difficulty of the word Saracen when it comes to ethnicity. It often
Mm.
just refers to their religion, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So we have a name. We have a real name for a most likely black African who lived and ran in 13th century England, and was
Yeah.
brought to the attention of the King's Justice. So
Mm, mm.
that's very interesting to me.
I think that's actually a magnificent example that you do have crusaders who were just like, oh, that person's unique. I'll just grab them and bring them back to England with me,
Yeah.
put them in a box. Horrible, horrible way to behave. But
It
yeah,
really
that's
is.
great that there's
But
solid evidence of that.
there was a thriving slave trade slavery was not outlawed in the Muslim world,
Mm.
so in the medieval
No, it
Muslim
wasn't.
world. And like
Mm.
some of the Muslim kingdoms were some of the latest ones to still have slavery be legal at the end of the 19th century.
Yeah,
And actually, as we know, in the Middle East, there's a lot modern forms of slavery are still a very going concern in the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. So
yeah.
so moving forward
Uh,
in time to the 14th
I was just
century.
thinking that.
Yeah, right. Um, Brushing past that delicate subject to the much less delicate subject of the Black Death. We have here, this is not the Smithfield Plague Cemetery, but we're going to be talking about the Smithfield Plague Cemetery because
Mm.
I love it when I can find different forms of evidence for a particular topic. Same fashion, any subject. I like to have the Trinity. I like to have the
I-
archaeological evidence. I like to have the documentary evidence, and if we can have visual evidence, all the better. So far we've had two of those three prongs. We've had visual evidence of people of color in England, particularly, we've had the documentary evidence, several different kinds, and now
Mm,
we have a plague cemetery. And this is where it gets
mm.
fascinating. So, in the Smithfield Plague Cemetery specifically, which is now part of London, but didn't used to be in the Middle Ages, was its own separate thing. Um,
Mm.
so we're talking dating, the cemetery dates 1348 to 1350. They have
Mhm.
found 3 women who have a DNA of African descent.
Okay.
Yeah. And 4 more women who have DNA of mixed African and English descent. Or European descent. Sorry, English
Oh,
is too strong a word. Of mixed African and European descent. So that's a total of 7 people in this Smithfield Plague Cemetery alone from this very concentrated period of time. And that's kind of the beauty of a plague cemetery, is that it dates itself. Um,
yeah.
and it provides a really, really short snapshot instead of other cemeteries where you might have centuries upon centuries of bones just jumbled together in some cases. Plague
Yeah.
cemeteries were unique in that you dumped everyone in and you covered it and you didn't open it again. You know.
Mm, mm, mm. God, that begs even more questions because that's not the period of the Crusades, that's the period of the Hundred Years' War. So now I'm even more confused because at least the evidence before we were like, oh, well, the trade link, the Crusades,
Right.
but this is the middle of the Hundred Years' War. Now I'm baffled. Is this people of African descent from the Crusader period,
Right.
or is this people who wandered in? We don't know because, as you said there, we're just dealing with the bone evidence from the DNA study that was done. So now I'm even more baffled and confused about that one. Do you know?
Well, I'm about to baffle you some more with some more
Oh God.
documentary evidence. But I want to briefly touch on, because we're talking about DNA evidence and bones. There have been tests done in various cemeteries across medieval England on teeth, on the teeth found in the
Mm,
skulls, to test specifically because you can tell something from the calcification of the teeth about where a
mm,
person was born, where they grew up,
yeah.
because what they grew up eating and drinking, the water especially, influences the composition of their teeth. But it's
Mm,
not. Some people say, well, that's clear proof because they have found people who had medieval cemeteries across England from a sampling. People who have teeth that have reflect the conditions in which people living in the Nile Delta would have had growing up. But the problem, I looked closer into the science behind that, is that it's not, those signatures aren't so unique. It's not it's not like the
yeah.
Nile Delta had a very unique signature that is found nowhere else in the world, and that
Mm,
the Douro River in Spain has a unique signature found nowhere else in the world. So all you can say is that these skulls in which they've analyzed these teeth, have a calcification that indicates that they did not grow up in this local area of the cemetery. There are similarities between them and, say, teeth that have been analyzed from medieval Egypt, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily came from medieval Egypt, because also maybe they found the same thing from people in Aquitaine in France, or right. So I that's why I
okay.
haven't gone into that evidence about the teeth and the claims that this means that they were actually raised in some part of Africa or some part of Asia and ended up somehow in England, because the science doesn't actually say that. It just says they may
Mm,
have, but not that they definitely did. So
okay.
I've decided not to go
Um,
to present those sets of numbers because I don't think it's really good solid evidence.
yeah, it's nice to put it out there, but God, as you said there, that it baffles me even still further because, I'm assuming this is the same period again. It's 1340, the Black
Exactly.
Death again.
Yep.
Yeah, and yeah, okay, okay. Other than trade, I really have no idea because once again, this is after the Crusades and stuff.
Well,
Um,
I'm
you know,
gonna give you some evidence that I think is gonna point heavily towards trade. um,
okay, that
so
makes sense.
our
That's the
next
only thing I can
our
think.
next bit, moving a little bit forward in time, 1380 customs
Mm,
declarations. I know it gets no more exciting than this, but actually, the image I have there is the actual customs declaration that I would like to talk about, the original one.
mm,
And it has to do with wool, which is why we have those adorable little sheepies up there and the shepherds, shearing the sheepies, looking all so happy,
mm,
everyone. So there is this customs declaration dates to 1380, and it mentions one Pater Africano, who multiple times, multiple mentions throughout the year, declaring his wool shipments that are being imported. So he is coming to England and importing wool, and which is weird because it usually went the other way. English wool was like the best of the best, but yeah.
Mm.
So Pater Africano is declaring imports of wool into London, into England, multiple times, and that name Africano that's not an accident. That is, and I'm trying to see if you can see his name. If I can actually show you. I don't know if, so can you see my mouse or not? I don't know if I remember to click on the option on OBS. But his name is actually, if you look in the left column, his name is, the first mention is the second one from the bottom. That's Africano Pater. They have his name backwards, but yeah, Africano Pater is their second from the bottom. That is his name right there.
No, I can't see the mouse.
So it's the second name from the bottom in the list. That is Africano Pater. And so, this is, I don't think it's an accident that he was noted that. Obviously, he didn't call himself. I'm confident that is not the name he used for himself. That is probably the name that the clerk gave to him, identifying him as being from Africa.
Okay.
And I'm pretty certain if he's calling him from Africa, it's not because he looks like he's English. So,
Oh, yeah, it's true.
From what part of Africa does he come? We don't know. Could be from Northern Africa. He could be, but there's no mention of him being a Saracen, which maybe they would have indicated if they felt that.
That's a good point. Yeah. It doesn't say what kind of wool he was bringing in, because I know that as we were saying, what was it, last week or 2 weeks ago or so, white wool was very important in the Irish trade system. But does it say here what sort of wool he was bringing in?
No, it doesn't. It's not that specific, unfortunately. I mean, you can see what you see before you is what I see, and it's not the most detailed records. It's it's quantities, it's the amount of customs paid. It's dates, it's that kind of thing. Yeah. So I just wanted to note, the interruption of ads is annoying. So I'd like to note that ads are one of the primary ways that Philip and I make our income as creators. So please don't block the ads, people. We don't get money for views. We really don't. We only get money for ads, for ad views, and specifically for ad clicks. So if you really want to support us, please don't block the ads. It's we get zero. We can't continue to do this if we're not actually getting some of those ad revenue incomes. It's the sad ecosystem in which we operate in YouTube. But the way we only get money from YouTube is if you view the ad, and we get significantly more if you actually click on the ad. Yeah. So please don't use ad blocker.
Yeah.
Okay, and I know it's annoying, but that's the ecosystem in which we have to operate. Okay.
And that helps pay for everything.
It does. It really does. I think you guys don't know how many hours of research I put into this presentation, and I'm certain Philip did as well.
From JSTOR to art books I have to purchase.
I was digging through manuscripts and research papers, and in multiple languages in my case, and in Philip's case too, digging through medieval Irish records. So keeping on with the excitement of medieval documents talking about the presence of Black Africans. So this is not, I was not able to find a facsimile of this. I only found this one in transcription, but I've put a picture of the Black Book of the Exchequer, which was started in the 13th century, just as a visual to give you an idea of what these Exchequer books look like, these tax records can look like. So they're English tax records from the 15th century that make references to three black, and it's very specific, it refers to them as black Africans paying taxes in the 15th century. So so we continue to have these references, and in this case we've had two financial references, which is why when you kept saying, Philip, you're like, how are these people getting here? It's got to be trade, right?
It's the only sense I can make of, to be honest with you.
It's got to be trade. Africa then, as now, is rich in minerals and resources that go far beyond, just gold. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
confident that it's all about trade, and
Yeah.
by the 15th century they might even be bringing black slaves, although I haven't found any evidence of that in England yet. We're not there yet.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be interesting if we had more of those medieval tax records left from medieval medieval Europe of medieval Ireland.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah,
But
definitely. Oh,
so
big
many
time in Ireland.
burnt up in 1922.
Yeah, sadly, a lot of the evidence for this is missing with the Irish Civil War, especially with the siege of the forecourt in 1923. That destroyed a whole load of hard evidence, especially documenting the trade going from the Middle East, sorry, the Mediterranean Sea into Dublin, the way that we can see here with the textbook that's going on in London at the time, especially in the 13th century, which seems very exciting with the Crusades and stuff going on, as you pointed out earlier.
Oh, that's weird. Okay, Michelle, thank you for that feedback. You're getting an ad every 2 minutes. That's crazy. What on earth is that shouldn't be coming that often. I'll see when I'm setting up the
Mm.
next one, and I'll have Philip do the same. See if we can pace the ads a little more evenly.
I
I don't.
reckon that's definitely an update on YouTube side, to be
Uh,
honest with you. There was a lot of updates that came in, so I reckon that's probably on the YouTube side. We'll have a look. Yeah, we'll have a look to see what the story is.
apologize for
And
that. Yeah. So the solution that Vercinge- Vercingetorix mentions, that's a great
yeah.
name, and I apologize if I didn't put the accent there, was to run two browsers, one with ads where you block and one without. One with ads
Mm.
and then one where you block, which is a good solution too.
But
Um,
it's strange because I actually have it running here, and I have the normal amount of ads. I'm not having ads every 2 minutes,
it's
so
weird.
I actually have no clue. It depends on region as well. Regions can
Oh,
bombard as well
right.
and have different forms of ads. But I'm based over in Japan, and I'm not getting that many ads to be quite honest with you. So it really depends.
Yeah, I'm
It could be
sorry,
a regional
Michelle.
update.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Michelle. We'll see if there's some control we can have over that at the next one, because sometimes there
Mm,
is. Of course, YouTube keeps making things worse for everyone. I don't know why.
mm. It's
Okay,
these adjustments with the updates are wild.
it really is. So
Mm,
I did mention that as of the 15th century, we start seeing a big increase in the presence of Black Africans in Europe and going into Northern Europe. And by the early 16th century, and I know the Tudor era for most people, that's the beginning of the English Renaissance. That no longer counts as medieval. But I still wanted to talk
mm.
about this because in my mind, 1511, 1506 to 1511 is still not exactly modern in England. It's still a pretty medieval
Yeah.
England. um,
Yeah. But
um,
yeah, you're going into the I'll say no more before I get
right?
bombarded with a whole
Yeah.
load of comments.
The Renaissance has not sprung upon England yet, shall we say? So
Mm,
John Blank is actually pretty famous in medievalist circles, or should be, I hope. And he is a
yeah.
trumpeter, and he's a black trumpeter who comes with Catherine
Mm.
of Aragon as a princess when she goes to marry Prince Arthur.
Yeah.
So she's from Aragon, right? She's from Spain. She's from Castilla, Leon, Aragon, that combined kingdom. And so that is, this is more evidence of just how prevalent black people had become in Spain, and how through that
Mm.
connection, now that the Reconquista is complete, and now that the Catholic monarchs are looking to spread their seed, as it were, their dynastic connections
Hi.
throughout Europe, when they send their children out, their children bring their entire household with them, and in those
Mm.
households are black people. Now, I
Yeah.
suspect that at this point, John Blank was probably not born in Africa. My feeling is he was probably born on the Iberian Peninsula, and
Yeah.
would have considered himself probably Spanish. He would have considered himself Aragonese.
Mm.
What's interesting is he ends up being a trumpeter in the household of Henry VII, actually on Henry VII's count books and in his employ. And then he goes on, when Henry VII dies, Henry VIII takes him on and continues to employ him.
Mm.
So what we
Yeah.
have here is an actual possibly a portrait of the man from life, because it actually is contemporary to him. This is the Westminster tournament roll. And it depicts a happy event that quickly becomes a sad event, because Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII have their first son, and they name him Henry, and they name him the Duke of Cornwall, and they have this, parades and festivities for days and days celebrating his birth. They have this big tournament, and Henry tilts in the honor of his beloved queen, and it's this beautiful, happy time in England. The country rejoices. The birth of the son of an heir means that hopefully they will not return to the chaos of the civil wars, right?
Mm.
And John Blank is recorded in these rolls as being one of the honored trumpeters who gets to be part of the parade that because they parade the baby out, right? Everyone needs to see this heir.
Yeah, of course.
And so these are the
Mm.
trumpeters who are announcing him. And so this is John Blank. We may be looking possibly, and it is entirely likely that the chronicler was present and actually witnessed the people and may have actually known John Blank as an actual
Yeah.
person.
Mm.
And
That's absolutely fascinating.
right? What's interesting
Especially
about
when
him,
this is.
no, go on.
No, it's interesting to me because the Wars of the Roses, as you said there, this is meant to be isolated, medieval, backwards England. Going in, we have an interpretation from the Wars of the Roses at the end of the Hundred Years' War, around 1450, all the way up to 1510, that our England is the backwater of Europe at this stage, that it's still medieval. It's waiting for the Summer King, Henry VIII, to come in there and start to bring in this kind of new renaissance into England and stuff. And so it's very interesting that even when England is depicted as the backwater during the period coming to the end of the Wars of the Roses, it still has people from Iberia moving in to England, and there's still that connection and movement of people. I think that's a good source to that.
It is exactly that. It's very fascinating. And what we have here, and this is delightful. I love it when you have the visual and the documentary evidence. This is it's the record in the account books of him being paid his wages. And so you can actually see item to John Blank, the Black Trumpet, for his month wage of November last past, at let me see, the place. I can't actually read. I don't actually know what that place is. On this day, so this man, had the name John Blank, and he's called the Black trumpeter. That was the name for trumpeter in early 16th century English, and it talks about his wages. Like this is a fantastic fight. Look how beautiful that calligraphy is.
It is absolutely gorgeous.
He was actually paid 20 shillings a year, which was twice as much as a farm laborer would earn in a year, and 3 times as much as a servant would earn. So just to put that in reference, he was pretty well paid, and he petitioned Henry VIII for a wage increase and got it. So he appears in the records multiple times, but we don't hear about him after 1517. He vanishes from the record after 1517. So
it's also very interesting the fact that you actually have proven record of Henry VII actually giving a pay rise, given the fact he's actually given the nickname the Winter King because of how what was it called? How
miserly he
what
was.
She used. Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for. How miser he was.
Yeah.
And especially towards his own nobles.
It is, yeah. So, and I know some people are going to scream, that's not medieval Europe, that's not the Middle Ages. Okay, you divide your medieval and modern Renaissance however you want. But, this man lived in late 15th, early 16th century England, for certain.
Yeah.
And it's, if you look at him, he's depicted differently than the other people. The other trumpeters have their hair in that stylish shoulder length bob, and they're not wearing anything on their heads, but he's wearing the kind of netted caul that you actually see on a lot of Landsknecht in this period.
Oh.
right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
If you go and look at Germans, and not just Landsknecht, but even German noblemen, if you go and look at them, they're
Mm,
wearing some people have mislabeled this as a turban. It's not a turban. I looked at it, and it looks
mm,
just like this intricate hairnet that has come into fashion in like the Saxony part of Germany, where the Landsknecht are wearing it. And I think if you look at how nice and full it is, I think that's because he's got a
mm.
nice full head of kinky curly hair. You know,
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
that's this is John Blank, and that he's depicted differently is possibly the reality of how he actually dressed when he was trumpeting for the king.
Mm, 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 mm. Quite interesting. We have a few people wondering if we can turn up the volume. Is anyone else having problems with the volume right now? Um,
Yeah, because
Sometimes it can dip here and there, the
it was
internet
going
connection.
what, yeah, thank you, because that's a good question, because everyone else was apparently having good volume until then. Yeah, so is other
Mm,
people, if you could just give us some feedback on how loud we are relative to each other, and also for you overall.
yeah. Because that
It
could be a dip in the internet because we did start off with a slight dip at the very start, but it seems to have fixed itself. So
Yeah,
it could be dipping again.
yeah. It's welcome to the world of technology. We hate it.
Oh, aye.
Okay, so
The
speaking
old
of
joys.
trumpeters, we're going to jump back in time, actually. So the idea of having black trumpeters becomes very fashionable in the 16th century, in part because these rulers in the 16th century are looking back to great rulers who came before them and had empires, and they're
Mm.
looking to Frederick II, who was both the king of
Oh,
Sicily
yeah.
and the Holy Roman Emperor, and the king of the
Mm.
Germans, etc., etc. And Frederick
Mm.
II is like the bad boy king of the 13th century. Extra History actually just produced a great series on him. If you want to be disturbed, go and watch it. Um, he was he was a
He's a
nutter.
fun guy.
He was he
Mm.
he was like an actually intelligent Elon Musk of the 13th century, instead of an Elon Musk who just steals people's ideas, because he had
Mm. Mm.
power and he had intelligence, but he was also a sociopath. So he had no problem doing horrible things to people in the name of science. But
Yeah, he liked doing his whole science experiment on
oh my
humans, like
god.
putting them in boxes alive.
Oh god, feeding them different meals, or feeding them the same meal, then having them do different things afterwards, then killing them and doing an autopsy to see what
It
digested
was
faster.
the one. But when I was reading the literature, it was the one where he wanted to experiment if the soul was real by putting people into boxes and then watching the box to see if something would come out of the box.
Yeah,
That's the one that was weird to me. Like,
that's the let me see. Yeah, it's I will just turn it up on my end when Rachel talks. Oh, so maybe there's a discrepancy in the volume. Philip is louder
yeah, I'll
than
just put my
Rachel, but
head
the
back
volume
slightly from the
isn't too
mic.
bad. Hmm.
Probably just
Interesting.
too close to the mic.
Maybe. Volume is good for me. Oh, it's so great when everyone has different outcomes.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So Frederick II he was in Sicily amongst other places, and he had an extremely multicultural court. He had African bodyguards, he had African military units, and black, specifically they're referred to as black. Um, he had black African trumpeters. And here is
Mm,
actually
mm,
an edict issued by Frederick himself, in Palermo, and he wants to find trumpeters from the black slaves in his court, and he specifies black slaves. And I'll get to that in a moment, but the language is interesting. He says, entrusting this request to your fidelity, we order that you should make a selection out of the black slaves of our court, if there are any suitable.
mm.
If you do not find any suitable black slaves in our court, you should buy up to 5 using our funds, who are from the ages of 16 to 20, and see to it that they are trained to play the trumpet. Let 4 of them be played for the trumpet, and 1 of them for the high trumpet, the alto, basically. And you
Mm.
should send them as quickly as possible, once they have been trained, to our presence, along with 4 trumpets and 1 high trumpet. Besides, since we have understood that certain Jews who have recently come to live at Palermo wish to cultivate our date plantation there, and are prepared to do so, we order you to make arrangements with them to this end, even if that means relaxing some of the rights of the crown. So it's interesting that gets
Mm.
slammed on to the end of this commission to go and find black slaves. Like, it's very clear he wants black slaves, and I'm confident this
Yeah.
is not Moorish. He wants black, and that is because that was a sign of his power as an emperor, that his empire ranged into the depths and distances of Africa, that he had black members of his court. So this is the 13th century. This is not the 14th, 15th, or 16th century. This is the 13th century. And that actually is what sets the stage for when these northern kingdoms in the 16th century start really establishing themselves. King James IV of Scotland in the early 16th century has 4 black trumpeters. Yeah, he has trumpeters and drummers. And what you see there, that picture, is actually an early 16th century Portugal also decided they wanted their core of black. And trumpeters is a loose word. It kind of refers to anyone playing a loud, annoying wind instrument. What you see there is actually a sackbut and then shawms on either sides of the sackbut. But this all of these 16th century rulers who are now that states are starting to coalesce and kingdoms are becoming powerful, they all kind of look back at the great Frederick II, who is still a legend at this point, and to show how far-flung and powerful and wide-ranging their growing kingdoms are, they want to have black musicians to show, that their range extends into the, far and beyond the extremities of the world, basically. So yeah, that's the 13th century, and then we're going to jump forward in time, not because there isn't other evidence in between, but because time is limited. And we're going to move up to 15th century Florence, and this definitely coincides the rise in the presence of the documented presence of black people in Florence coincides absolutely with the Portuguese creating, opening up the Atlantic slave trade starting in 1440. And so here we have this. This is actually an illumination, part of a popular. I forget the name. It's depicting like a well set up kitchen, I think. And so it's not a story. It's not fantasy. It's supposed to depict a workaday kitchen and how it should be properly set up for the average common person. And here we have very clearly a black African woman. Like, there's no question. This is not someone from Palestine. This is not someone from Lebanon. And this is the 1460s is what we're looking at.
1460s. Okay, so you're looking into the peak of Florence's massive trade. It's made trade, massive trade network.
This is what I affectionately call peak Florence.
Okay.
And so this is a visual, but I've got some really fascinating documentary evidence about a possibly black African couple, or black couple for certain. They were slaves, but the reason we know about them specifically and that they were black is because the black man, who's not actually named, but he's identified as being black. He was named. Where'd my little notebook go? Damn it, sorry, I forgot to write his name down.
I know.
The little one, yeah. He brings his baby, to an orphanage, to the Convent of the Innocents. And this baby is relatively newborn, not like exactly freshly newborn, but like a month, like probably a month old, possibly, is how it's described. It's okay.
Yeah.
And he wants to surrender the baby, and the mother is actually named. Her name is Lisabetta, and she is described as being Nera. And Nera is a word for black, but it can mean kind of different shades of black. It could mean mixed black, or maybe a white Italian parent and a black African other parent, or it could just mean black, right? But the word negra, so the baby is named Lucia Negra, and negra in this era apparently meant black, not
Okay.
The woman we're looking at now would probably have been identified as Negra. And so
Ah.
this baby whose name is Lucia Negra, was given up at the orphanage. And it's very interesting because her father is described as Nero, her mother is described as Nera, and for whatever reason, the clerk felt it was necessary to note that down. Uh,
Hmm.
you know, for whatever reason. And the thing that's really fascinating about this is that little baby Lucia being given up at an orphanage. So her parents, and both parents are identified as being slaves, by the way. But the
Hmm.
fact that she's given up in an orphanage means that she will not be a slave because
Okay.
she will have no parents. Because in Florence, your status was determined by the status of your father, not your mother. So
Ah.
this is why we have a lot of natural born sons, as they were called back then, of great Italian condottieri and other noblemen who end up being raised
Hmm.
then as noblemen and even going to inherit their titles and property because their father was a nobleman. Didn't matter what their mother was, even if she was a slave. But in this case,
Hmm.
the father is a slave. And what's interesting is the record says that their owner, whose name I forgot to note down and I've forgotten, but their owner, who by the way had multiple babies given up at the orphanage, is not the
Hmm.
father. He's not recorded as being the father, but he ordered them to take the baby there. And by doing so,
Yeah.
he was liberating the baby because that baby would have free status automatically by virtue of being an orphan.
Ah, that makes perfect sense. So it's people that kind of, I hate saying the word exploiting, but they
Right.
kind of have to because given the situation they're in Florence. And just to highlight once again, we're not dealing with the Florence of the 13th century. We're dealing with 15th century Florence, which is a part of a massive trade network throughout the entirety of the, as I said multiple times, the Mediterranean world, not the European world, which connects us into the wider Islamic world. That's the Florence we're dealing with. We're not dealing with what was it called, 13th century Florence. We're dealing with 15th century
Right.
Florence, which has these connections, which brought these people in as slaves, who now have to kind of take advantage of the situation that they're in to free their children. It makes perfect sense
Exactly.
to me.
And what's interesting is that their owner is enough of a humanitarian to allow them to do that because he's giving up a resource, right? Hypothetically,
Mm,
that baby could go on to become part of his household. Basically free human I mean, he's going to have to pay for it to be fed and dressed and all that, but he doesn't have to
yeah.
buy another slave. They have made another slave for him. But instead, he gives them the blessing to take this baby and give it free status and allow it a chance at a life as a free man. So
Yeah.
that's an interesting. We don't know what his motivations were because I wasn't able to find Ricordanze for him at all, let alone if he
Mm.
actually recorded. I feel that it is good and right that this baby should be free. Probably he would never have written something like that anyway. But the
Is
fact
it
that
the
yeah,
fact
go on.
Is it the fact, like, okay, so my understanding, and you've undermined it now a few times throughout this, is the fact that the papacy does solidly believe that slavery is wrong, especially towards Christians. Is it the fact that he feels that this may have been his Christian duty to free these people, especially if they were Christian?
That could be it. But on the other hand, these black slaves, once they end up in Europe, nearly always end up converting, and that doesn't seem to earn them freedom.
Oh, well,
And
okay.
God knows it definitely didn't earn them freedom in the United States. But
Yeah,
that's
that's very true.
obviously later. That's a later period, whole different
Mm,
ball game
mm,
than
mm,
what we're dealing with in Italy. Um, so yeah, unfortunately, we do know what happens to Lucia, and it's kind of sad. But I learned something interesting about the culture of orphans in Italy in this period, in Florence at the
mm,
very least, and I'm going to assume probably elsewhere. So apparently, women, patrician women, noble women in Italy did not wet nurse their own babies. They did not nurse them.
mm.
They hired a
Okay.
wet nurse for that. So when a woman
Mm,
was getting close to her confinement, to her laying in, to the time when she would give birth, they would hire the wet nurse to come and just be present so that the moment the baby was born, the wet nurse would be on hand. But the baby wasn't there yet. So they had to make sure that the wet nurse's milk kept flowing. So they would actually rent out new babies nursing babies from the orphanages to keep the milk of the wet nurse flowing until the lady's baby was actually born. And
Ah,
Lucia was actually rented out for that
mm.
exact purpose. Unfortunately, she died while she was
Oh
being
no.
used as a wet nurse pump, basically.
Oh
Um,
God.
Now, granted, if you think about it, this is a very clever way for an orphanage to actually kind of double their income because, on the one hand,
Yeah.
the noble household is feeding the wet nurse who's then feeding the baby, and they're also getting
Mm, mm.
income from the rental of the baby. And, the orphanages have to have money to operate. So I don't, I can't blame them. They can't operate on air. They have to operate on
Yeah.
donations and whatever income they can get. And it's certainly, then they don't have to pay for a wet nurse. They literally, being paid to let someone else wet nurse this baby. So it might seem cold and callous from our modern
Yeah.
perspective, but it's very
I was about to
pragmatic.
say that.
Yeah, it's very
Yeah, I
pragmatic.
always, yeah, looking at this, I always had to take it from a medieval perspective rather than a modern perspective because, God, if that happened today, God, I'd be up in arms. But yeah, maybe I am a bit dull and cold-hearted because I'm so much in the habit of looking at it from a medieval perspective. I was like, when you said that, as a complete sociopath when it comes into looking at medieval literature, I was just like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, from a modern perspective, that's absolutely disgusting. Do you know,
Right,
absolutely
right. Exploiting
unacceptable. Like,
exploiting helpless orphan babies in that way, but in this era, wet nurses are not free, and there is no baby formula, and cow's milk
mm,
will destroy a child's digestive tract, right? So
yeah, yeah,
the option, and orphanages don't have money probably to pay wet nurses. That's expensive. Wet nursing is a full-time profession. They get paid pretty decently to do that. So
mm,
renting the baby out is a way to make sure that these orphans don't die of starvation. In
mm,
So I just want to put that out there. They I think that it was done from a place of compassion and pragmatism both combined, this idea. But
mm,
in
mm,
any
mm.
case, for Lucia, it didn't end well. She ended up dying, but that likely had nothing to do with the wet nursing, because she didn't die because the baby was born. She died while they were still waiting for the baby to be born. It's a
Yeah,
dangerous
yeah.
time for newborn babies in this era. White
It is sadly.
infant mortality is through the roof, and is one of the reasons that the average age in the Middle Ages is so low. It's got nothing to do with how long
Mm,
adults lived. It's got to do with how long
yeah.
babies didn't.
Yeah, that's also a very, very good point. Survival rate was terrible all the way up to the 1920s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, and in America, we're going back that way. So progress. Fantastic.
Okay, moving on.
So moving on. So from Lucia, Lisabetta, and her father, in 1487, we have another reward being offered for an escaped slave, um,
Mm,
a black slave, and he's described as being black and, interestingly, being dressed in black in the Spanish fashion, which might indicate the connection of getting black slaves through Spain, right? Because if he's
mm, mm,
wearing
mm.
the clothes in which he was sold, those being in the Spanish fashion, it might indicate that connection. He also may have come up through Naples, which was also, of course, a Spanish kingdom in the 15th century, was
Ah,
ruled
yeah,
by the
yeah.
Aragonese. So, this kind of
Mm,
highlights those connections. The Portuguese open up the Atlantic slave trade, and then that proceeds onward to Spain, obviously, which then connects directly to Italy. And so, we that's what I meant by we start seeing an increased documentary evidence of the presence of black Africans in Italy in this era. Yeah.
yeah. And also, we're going into the Italian wars as well. So, where before we saw a few breaks in, was it the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire, we're definitely seeing a lot now with the Italian wars.
Yeah. Yep. Nope. Okay, so moving on, I just this painting is from the late 15th century in Italy, and it actually, if
Mm,
you look at the bottom corner, there's a black donor depicted in the
yeah.
bottom there, which that means that there was a black person who was wealthy enough to actually commission an altarpiece. I guess early 16th century on this one, actually, but still,
Mm, mm.
um, that sort of indicates that not, and we know this, we know that not all black Africans in Europe in the 15th and 16th century were necessarily slaves. in Portugal, we have a great portrait of one who's in the Portuguese knightly order, for instance, riding a
Mm,
horse
mm, mm,
dressed very well indeed. And we
mm,
also start to see a lot more visual evidence of black people in paintings. But that's the 16th century is kind of easy to identify black Africans in Europe. They become much more prominent. But I just want
yeah,
to
yeah.
step back to Constantinople, um, right around the time of the sack of Constantinople in 1204. And this is
Mm,
actually a Venetian mosaic depicting, almost contemporaneously depicting the fall. And there were lots of Venetians present for that. They were the ones who kind of inspired the idea that we should sack Constantinople and take all its riches. So there's a
mm,
French chronicler, um, in of the French, Frank, as they were called, of the Fourth Crusade, and he talks about this Nubian king, and it's very interesting. So he says, and while the barons were there at the palace, that being what is now Topkapi Palace, but wasn't Topkapi Palace back then,
mm,
a king came whose skin was all black, and he had a cross in the middle of his forehead that had been made with a hot iron. This king was living in a very rich abbey in the city, in which the former emperor Alexios had commanded that he should be lodged, and of which he was to be lord and owner, as long as he wanted to stay there. And so historians actually theorize that this was King Moses Georgios. And this is a mural of him. The kingdom was Marukia, I think. It was part of, again, what they referred to as Nubia in the 13th century Europeans, because not such a great understanding, but within their own part of the world, they refer to themselves as Marukia. And this is actually apparently a contemporary mural of him from Fraras Cathedral. And this, this king, this Nubian king, as they called him, was apparently on this, he had stepped down from the throne, and he was on this massive pilgrimage, according to this chronicler, who marvels over him being all black, by the way. And that pilgrimage was to go take him from Constantinople, where he was at this time, and had been given this abbey as his residence. And then his plan was to go all the way to Rome, and, I didn't include the map, all the way to Rome, and then to Santiago de Compostela, and then back to Jerusalem, where he intended to die, according to his words. And of course, he had his entire entourage with him. He was not just a lone king in this abbey. He had his entire entourage with him of people from his kingdom. And this is the early 13th century. Now, unfortunately, the trail kind of goes cold on him. We don't know if he ever finished his pilgrimage. He was fairly old at this point, and that's part of the reason he was making this pilgrimage and he'd abdicated his throne. He wanted to finish his life in what he considered to be a holy contemplative manner. But
mm.
that Robert of Clary kind of actually very focuses here in roughly 1204, that his skin was all black, is interesting because it notes that to him, at any rate, to Robert of Clary, this was unique and different, right?
Yeah, it kind of supports more of what we were saying earlier about how the 13th century was very much a period because of the Crusades and the connections from Mali into the Caliphate and then into the Mediterranean and stuff. We see way more evidence. So it seems to be in the Crusader period, it seems to be very kind of, I wouldn't say completely colorful, but there's a good bit of color in there.
It is,
Um,
yeah.
and
Well,
it's quite interesting as well. Sorry.
no, go on.
It's quite interesting as well that we do see kind of a dip when it comes down to the Black Death and stuff. It seems like sort of like after the death of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick, that there's a bit of a kind of a dark, because I kind of felt like there's a bit of a renaissance with the Crusades and stuff, and then there's kind of a dip back into the Dark Age as we go into the late medieval period,
Right.
and then it picks up again as we go into the Italian Wars and stuff. That we have a new renaissance from
Yeah.
that period
No,
onwards, and it's interesting that that's when it gets colorful again.
it is, and I think the Black Death has certainly a great deal to do with that.
Yeah.
I mean, it disrupted so much, all the trade routes. It disrupted societies. It laid waste to Europe literally. So yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. Is that there's this this interruption,
It's
basically.
yeah, it's very interesting that we're looking at people's skin color, which goes into the trade networks, and then instead of just seeing Dark Age all the way up to the late medieval period with the 15th century, in fact, we're actually seeing dips of a Renaissance, Dark Age, Renaissance, Dark Age. That it's
Right.
actually we're dealing with 1,000 years of history, and instead of seeing it all under the umbrella term, actually, when we look at the evidence of the connection into Africa from the Mediterranean, what we're actually seeing is that there's peaks of like a Renaissance in Europe, then back into a Dark Age again, back into Renaissance.
Yeah.
That it's not black and white the way we thought it was before.
It
Quite literally in this
you're
conversation.
absolutely right. It's not a linear progression at all, not even a little bit.
Mm,
So we're going to wrap up then with Bohemia because that's where we started. Why are we doing this? Because there's been this ridiculous controversy and a whole lot of bigotry and racism coming out about
mm,
Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 because of the depiction of our Malian traitor. So I'd like to talk
mm.
about the evidence I did find for Prague, for what is now the Czech Republic, what was Bohemia or Czechia. Um, and, we kind of start actually with this. So there was this actually as of the first millennium, sort of the 900s to the 11th century, there was this massive trade network that included the Silk Road, but was also a slave trade network, where Prague was one of the foci of that network. It
Mm.
was a major crossroads from east, west, north, and south. And you can see
Yeah.
that here on this map, just how interconnected Prague in that era was. And we even have this depiction here is Saint Adalbert pleading with the Duke of Bohemia for the release of Christian slaves, who were
Mm,
apparently owned by Jewish merchants, which that's probably pretty typical of the sort of anti-Jewish sentiment that was floating around.
mm.
But the point is that Prague was at this nexus of a slave network that certainly
Yeah.
connected into Africa, literally ran across it. And to think that those points of ports right there along the Red Sea and along northern Africa, along the Mediterranean, to think that those were were just Arabs that's ridiculous. They were of
Yeah.
course pulling people
Yeah.
from further afield.
Mm.
And
That's why when you actually look at the size of that trade network, it's
right,
absolutely
it's
wild
insane. It's
to
this
think.
crazy. The,
Yeah,
crossing the Gobi
because
Desert for God's
I
sake. I mean, wow.
ah like
So
it must have been something special then because yeah, sorry.
right, no, absolutely. It was definitely something special. So we just have to move a little quickly because I do have a train to catch. So I wanted to look for the actual evidence. Now I have no Czech language skills, so I was not able to do the kind of documentary source depth of source that research that I might normally do for my other language areas.
Mm,
But that being said, we do have an interesting, again, it dates to the 14th century, so it seems to be plague time. They found,
mhm.
Czech archaeologists found what they are pretty certain is a black woman's skull in a medieval
Oh,
burial ground at Teton Castle. And I don't know if I pronounced
mm,
Teton correctly, Tetin. I don't know what the rules of Czech pronunciation are. Tetin. And the reason they
mm,
think
mm,
this is the skull of an African woman is because when they did the facial reconstruction, the shape of the nose bone, the cheekbones, the shape of the forehead, all of that are very typical of sub-Saharan African morphology. And we
mm, mm,
obviously that can be a dangerous ground to wander into, but we do know that we do especially skull reconstructions all the time to try to get a look at the face of the
mm,
person that was. And when they talked about if they did a reconstruction on this, they're pretty certain they would end up with someone who had very African features. And
yeah, yeah.
that's contemporary with those skeletons that have DNA in medieval
Mm,
in Smithfield, in the plague cemeteries of Smithfield.
mm, mm,
So,
mm,
there's one last piece of evidence for Prague, for Bohemia, and it's kind of it's this painting represents a broader base of evidence. Starting in the 14th century and going into the 15th century, we suddenly see St. Moritz as painted as being black and black African. And
mm,
so this was painted by Theodosius of Prague, and this gentleman, he's got kinky hair, he has very African, very sub-Saharan African features, but this is depicting Saint Maurice. And you also start seeing at this time, especially in the areas of the Holy Roman Empire, in Bohemia, you start seeing one of the three magi in the nativity scene, the adoration of the magi, being depicted as black African, Balthazar specifically. Whereas in the earlier periods, they're always depicted as whatever the local people look like. But suddenly, 14th century moving forward, it becomes increasingly common to the point where by the 16th century, that's just the way it is.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense. As the trade routes are improving again, as we were saying earlier, we're now starting to seeing that connection, the greater connection of the Mediterranean Sea into Africa, because as your map clearly shows, Europe crossing the stream into the Mediterranean, into Africa, there's your connection right away. So once those connections are rebuilt again, then we have those trade networks back into Africa again. And that makes perfect sense, that there's a change in the coloration of people.
Yep, and that's exactly it. So this is why I do not think it is very clear to me when we get back to St. Lawrence. Yeah, it is very clear to me that people in medieval Bohemia could have absolutely seen the occasional black African, for various reasons, as maybe a member of someone's court, as a slave in someone's court, as a trader, as a mercenary, as a soldier, not mercenary, but in actual fealty, for many reasons. And God knows, by the time of Maximilian, Maximilian the First, it is absolutely, he has black people in his entourage, and there are black Landsknecht, in fact, by that point. So, I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility. I think there's probably more evidence out there specifically for Bohemia, but encountering one Malian trader along the way. Now, would that trader have been out there in the boondocks where the character of Henry is? Yeah. I mean, if he got really, really lost, maybe, but less likely.
But the Pacific character isn't just wandering the wilderness. He's in with the Hungarian army. And he says himself that he's been caught up between the fighting that's going on in the Balkans.
He's not out there in the middle of nowhere then. Okay.
Yeah, no, he's with the Hungarians. And he says he has been caught up with the fighting between the Ottoman Empire, which is connected to the Mediterranean, which is connected to Mali and all that kind of stuff. So the Ottoman Empire, if you don't know, is a Muslim empire that's connected to the wider Muslim world of Africa and the Middle East. So that's how those people were coming into Eastern Europe, Eastern and Central Europe. And then from there, the Holy Roman Emperor, King Sigmund, picked up our Mali friend, and he's marching with him. That's what's going on there.
Vercingetorix says Rachel really wears her politics on her sleeves. Oh no, you haven't heard anything about my politics today. Yeah. You've only touched the surface. No, but I mean, is it possible? Yes. Do I have documentation of such an encounter? No. But, I'd like to close with the idea that, especially when it comes to these games, that they claim to be historical, but really they're fantastical. They're supposedly set in a period of history that was real, but their level of authenticity is always questionable. And what some people get upset about as being inauthentic is interesting, because there's plenty of inauthenticity in Kingdom Come Deliverance too. We've talked about the clothing, we've talked about the food, we've talked about the depiction of dance and interior spaces, but these people aren't getting upset about that. No, they're getting upset because there's one single black person.
Yeah, it was kind of just a complete ignorance. I remember when I was doing the live stream and people were curious about the man that was there. And when I went and interacted with him, he talked and spoke about the Mediterranean trade, Venice, and the Ottoman Empire. And when you're on a live stream talking to people that do work 9 to 5, they don't really have time to sit down and study the Ottoman Empire. its connections with Africa, the Muslim world, from Africa to the Middle East. So yeah, I think it's forgivable for a lot of people to not know why a man from Mali has ventured into the from the Ottoman Empire into the Balkans, and then from the Balkans into the Holy Roman Empire. And so it's great to have these conversations today, so we can learn more about the greater trade networks. For me, I did learn, and I did kind of broaden my mind afterwards. You knew that straight away. Halfway into this conversation today, I did notice straight away that during the Black Death, that's when we have a lack of movement between people in the Mediterranean Sea. But then, as we were noticing in the 13th century, during the peak of the Crusades, we have the Renaissance with the Holy Roman Empire under Emperor Frederick. That's when you see a whole load of movement happening between Africa, the Middle East, and Europe inside of the Mediterranean Sea. Then it dips down with the Black Death, and then it seems to rise back up again in the 15th century going into the Italian Wars. And once again, we see people of colour starting to pop up again. And then as we go into the slave trade, that's when they really start to pop up in all the literature and stuff.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
something that I found very interesting with our conversation today, that it does seem to be a point of anytime we're having economic, kind of going into an economic golden age, that's where people of colour start to pop up in all the literature. That I think is very, very fascinating. And the moment we go into some form of economic dark age, that's where people of colour just disappear again.
Right. Yeah. It is. It is.
Yeah.
And it, it totally makes sense. Okay, well, everyone,
Mm.
I really do have to literally run. If you have any more questions, and I saw a question about Prester John, and I don't have time to get into Prester John, but yeah, I really don't. We could do a whole presentation just on Prester John. Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining Philip and me today. I hope you've enjoyed it and learned some things. And we will not, so Philip, I won't have to be able to live stream for the next 2 weekends because I've been hired to teach medieval dance at 2 living history events. So I will not
Oh
be
no.
available in this time slot. But we'll be back in 3 weeks with something fun and interesting for you all.
As always. Thanks very much, guys, for having and coming over from my channel over to Rachel. Rachel, thank you so much for hosting me today. I won't say any more words because you literally have to fly out the
Yeah, I
window.
do.
So I'll see you later, lads, and Slán go bhfuilte.
Okay, bye everyone. Stay creative.
Bye.
Extra sunglasses are in your bag here.